Okay, Ken, if you can start the broadcast, Chair, if you can wait 10 seconds and then start the meeting, please.
Good morning and welcome to the Economy and Enterprise Overview and Scrutiny Committee meeting for this morning, Monday, the 7th of December 2020. I'm Councillor Malcolm Clark, representing Delves Lane and the chair of this committee. This is a remote meeting which has been recorded live to the Council's website and will be available to be viewed for a minimum of 6 months. Please be aware that any footage from this meeting could be used in subsequent media broadcasts. I would like to give a warm welcome to members of the committee, to officers and any members of the public or media who are watching our live feed. I'd also like to give a warm welcome to members of our Safer and Stronger Communities Overview and Scrutiny Committee who have been invited to attend for agenda item 6. Moving into the agenda itself, item number 1, apologies for absence. Have we any apologies for absence, please?
Thanks, Chair. We've got apologies from Councillor Sexton.
Thank you. Item number 2, substitute members. Have we any substitute members, please?
We've got no substitute members today, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Item number 3, minutes of the meeting held on the 30th of October 2020. Are there firstly any matters arising from that meeting? I'll take it that everything's in order, so can we agree the minutes from the 30th of October as a correct record?
Moving, Chair.
Thank you. There's no dissent on that, so we will accept those as a true record. Item number 4, declarations of interest. Do we have any, please? Thank you, members. Remember to declare if relevant at the appropriate time so they're recorded. Thank you. Item number 5, items from co-opted members or interested parties, if any.
Thanks, Chair. No items have been notified. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got a message in the chat from Councillor Tucker. If that could be noted by committee services in relation to the minutes, please. Just to make sure that's recorded correctly. It's sorry. Page 9 in the minutes, in the paragraph with Councillor Tucker's name, it has inquiries twice instead of just inquiries, so it's just a case of removing a word. Thanks very much. Moving on to agenda item 6, which is our housing update. A joint report of the Corporate Director of Resources and the Corporate Director of Regen, Economy and Growth. We have a number of officers presenting to us today, and I'll ask if they can introduce themselves at the time that they take over the presentation. Just for members' benefit, this is the only item of substance on the agenda today, which means the presentation is actually going to be a longer presentation than what we're used to in its entirety. Obviously, this is a housing special, hence the concentration on this one issue. What we've decided to do in order to assist in technical issues is we're going to leave the presentation on in between each section, but we're going to give members the opportunity to ask questions at the end of each subsection. Officers did advise me that some of the questions you might have might well be covered at a later stage in the presentation, but it's up to members. You can ask questions when officers have finished their section or wait until the end. It's just to give everyone, there's a lot of information coming and the presentation will take a little bit longer than usual. With that, I'd like to hand over to our officers and invite them to present to us this morning, please. We'll just give them a moment to get the presentation online.
Good morning, Chair and committee members. My name is Graham Smith and I'm the policy team leader in the Council's Spatial Policy team. So this presentation, as per your associated report, will provide an update on housing matters. Just loading up the first slide there. Okay then, for the presentation today, first of all, Marie and I are going to provide some context to both the housing strategy and the homelessness strategy. We think it's really useful to provide a bit of a recap on these documents. You'll be aware that we've been to overview and scrutiny with these documents before, particularly in their development stages, but we think it's really helpful to kind of give an overview of their key content, key priorities, because this then goes on to inform the delivery updates you're going to get and the information that you'll receive in the bulk of the presentation. So as you'll see from this slide, the main portion of this presentation is to provide members with an update across a range of areas, including homelessness, rough sleeping, and the response to COVID-19, an update on activities and work in the private rented sector area, and an update on selective licensing. Now to note, you do have Lynn Hall down on that slide as being the presenter for the selective licensing, but my understanding is that John Kelly is going to provide that update today for you. Okay then, so in terms of the housing strategy, I'm aware that you will have seen this as it's developed and have had a number of presentations on this, but I think it is useful just to provide a bit of context to the housing strategy, which then informs some of the updates to follow. So the first thing to say is that housing strategy was adopted in July 2019. And this is a document which has been developed to consider housing issues right across the county. And it considers all types of housing issues that you might expect to be in a housing strategy. So, for example, it includes information and advice on providing support for people to access a home. It talks about providing support for people in their homes. It also has content on delivery and development of new homes for people to live in to meet needs, and also has content on the council's approach to improving existing housing stock. So the housing strategy itself provides effectively a framework to coordinate delivery and investment in housing activity. So in this context, the housing strategy provides clear messages on the priorities of the council and its partners, and also has been developed to support partnership working. The strategy has also been developed to ensure that the council and its partners are well positioned to maximise any future funding opportunities and any support that may be available. We've done this by setting out a number of best practice case study examples within the housing strategy itself. The thinking behind this is that it really demonstrates the type of good work that's gone on in County Durham and the types of activities we could look to take in the future. And we think that gives a good flavour for the type of activities we can do with the relevant support. We also think having a clear strategy enables the council to demonstrate its priorities for action and intervention so that we're very clear on what we want to do. Now, I've mentioned that the housing strategy sets out the kind of key priorities for housing across the county. There's a full list of those in the report, but on the slide, I've just pulled out a number of these key priorities, and I'll just run through them quickly now. So first and foremost, the housing strategy sets out to put people first and focus on the housing needs of residents in County Durham. We think this is a really important principle. What it does is it ensures that the housing strategy moves beyond what you might call bricks and mortar approaches to really understand how best we can support the residents and tenants of County Durham. And it's this principle which guides the content of the strategy. In terms of other key messages, the housing strategy notes that the council will continue to focus on raising standards in the private rented sector. The housing strategy sets out that the council would seek to have greater licensing powers in order to tackle poor landlords. And in this context, there will be an update on selective licensing as part of this presentation. In response to the ageing population in the county, in which both the number and proportion of older people are increasing, the housing strategy sets out a key priority to ensure homes are delivered to meet the needs of older people. So that's a key priority of the housing strategy. The housing strategy also notes as a key priority that the council will work within those communities most affected by long-term empty properties Whenever we talk about long-term empty properties, we're talking about homes which have been empty for 6 months or more. So the intention of the housing strategy is to bring back empty homes into use wherever that is possible and wherever we think we can do that. You will be receiving a presentation on, as part of this presentation, update from the empty homes team. And the final key message I've extracted on this slide and brought out reflects the Council's intention to maximise the delivery of affordable housing to meet needs in the county. As you'd expect, we do that through the County Durham Plan and through our work directly with Homes England.
Thank you, Graham. Morning, everyone. My name is Marie Smith and I'm a housing manager as part of the Housing Solutions team here at the council. I'm going to cover sort of 4 key areas in the next few slides. First of all, just a little bit of a refresher on what the aims of our homelessness strategy are. As Graham mentioned, I know we have been and spoken to you a few times on these, but I thought it would be helpful just to refresh what we're trying to achieve. Then go on to some headline statistics for Housing Solutions, just to put things into context so it can give you an overview of how we are performing as a service. Particular some issues around our response to COVID and how we've dealt with that and what the trends have shown us, because I know members have put questions in about that and are keen to understand that. And the final point is just really how we've worked with the registered housing providers over that time and some of the partnership work and that's gone on there. So they're the 4 areas that I'm going to cover for you. Okay, Graham. So this is just a refresh of the aims of our homelessness and rough sleeping strategy. So it's a 3-year strategy. It was approved with the overall housing strategy framework. And basically, they're the 3 aims along the top that we're trying to achieve in County Durham. We're trying to prevent homelessness through early intervention. And you'll see as I go on through the slides, we are actually achieving that. We've always had that approach as a council for the last few years now, and we are proven to be successful at that, so people do not reach that crisis point. The second thing we're trying to do is increase access to and the supply of accommodation. We have done lots of partnership work and we have got more accommodation available, but we still would like more, particularly for people with complex needs. And that leads us on to the third aim, which is about support, because a lot of the clients who come to our service often have support needs, so they need support to maintain a tenancy. The bottom part of the slide just shows what we're trying to achieve around rough sleeping, and Marion Rucker, who's on the call, will give you a little bit more information on that at the moment. But basically, there's 4 key things that we're trying to achieve, and this is exactly in line with the government's aim, rough sleeping strategy. We're trying to prevent it in the first place. Then we're trying to sort of intervene for those people who are rough sleeping and helping them on the streets, which we've proven to be successful at the moment. And then it's about recovery, just to prevent that people returning to the streets. And the 4th element, which is very important, is education. So we're trying to do some comms and awareness raising with a whole host of partners to understand about rough sleeping and what it is. So that was just a refresher of the overarching aims of homelessness and rough sleeping that we are trying to achieve. Thanks, Graham. Just thought it would be helpful as well, because the strategy's been in place for a year now. It is a 3-year strategy, but this is just a brief overview of some of the things in the last year that we have achieved. And Graham and I are working on an overall report, an annual report on both progress on the housing and homelessness strategies. So just a couple of things that we've achieved. We've implemented a duty to refer, which is a statutory requirement, and that's where other public bodies have a duty to refer into our service if they have somebody who is homeless. So for example, prisons, hospitals, a lot of council colleagues, so they must refer in to Housing Solutions when they have a homeless client. The big thing we've done on the health side is we've worked up a hospital discharge protocol which goes beyond the duty to refer, and we're looking to roll that out right across all the general needs hospitals at the moment, where someone is referred to us, not only if they're homeless, but also if they're going back to unsuitable housing. So I think that's a really good piece of work that has now been produced, but we're now looking to implement that over the next few months. Just thinking of increasing the supply of accommodation, we have done some fantastic work with our housing providers and private landlords who have actually provided us with some accommodation to help increase that supply. I think the most important thing at the moment is that we're reviewing data, and we've now got a clearer understanding of what support needs some of our clients have. And we're seeing that we've got some of the highest mental health needs really across the region. So we need to address that and work with colleagues in public health, etc., to provide support. With COVID, one of the key things was that we needed to review what our service offer is for clients in financial difficulty, because obviously we've got a lot of people in poverty for a whole host of reasons, and that continues to be the main reason why people contact our service. So we have done a whole review of what that offer is and how we can help people. And then in terms of rough sleeping, which, as I said, Marion will come on to, we've now got a team who work, actively with rough sleepers on the streets. That was just an overview of some of the things that have been achieved in the last year. Thanks, Graham. Just as a service, because I always think it's helpful, because Housing Solutions is predominantly we do deal with homeless clients, but we also do a whole range of other things. So that just gives you an overview of some of our key performance headline statistics for 1920. So it gives you a flavour of how many people contact our service. So that's over 13,000. Over 2,000 properties have been improved, adapted or brought back into use. So we offer a range of products to help people improve their properties. We work with adult social care on adaptations. 212 were empty properties that were brought back into use. And then there are our figures that show you how we're doing in terms of prevention of homelessness. So we helped 541 people to stay at home, and we helped 993 people find alternative accommodation. So they're the key headline figures that are reported corporately. Thank you. Thanks, Graham. When we talk about homelessness and the Homelessness Reduction Act, I always think it's worth refreshing some of the terms that are used, because us who are in the detail on a daily basis who talk about prevention and relief, sometimes I think it's just always worth, because some of those figures that I'm going to come on to shortly will show that, and it's just worth refreshing to members of the committee what the different elements of the Homelessness Reduction Act mean. So when we talk about prevention, this is where statutorily we've got a duty to prevent. So we've got to work with people who are threatened with homelessness within 56 days. So it may be that they're not homeless at the moment, but they potentially are going to be homeless. Then we have what's called a relief duty. And this is where people who are homeless now. So basically we've got to try and help them find accommodation. And then if we haven't been successful to prevent homelessness or relieve homelessness, we have what's called a main housing duty, and that's where if the other two areas have been unsuccessful and the applicant meets the criteria set out by government, then we have to find accommodation for that person. Next slide, Graham, thanks. So just in terms of the figures, the numbers that we deal with as a service, just so you can see, in 1920, we had just over 7,500 people present as homeless or threatened with homelessness or in need of housing advice. The main client group who come to us is single people, and that trend has continued over the last few years. As I mentioned before, the service offer for clients in financial difficulty is being reviewed, because that continues to be one of the main reasons why people come to us for advice. They're falling into poverty or they're falling into rent arrears, etc. Obviously, the impact of the lifting of the eviction ban is a big thing for us at the moment, and I have got a couple of figures to show you that. So current position is the ban has been lifted, but no one will be evicted for the period of 6 months up until March, unless there's serious issues of domestic abuse or antisocial behaviour. So we're working very closely with our registered providers and private landlords where we can, and the corporate colleagues who are heading up the poverty plan, just to make sure that we're ready and prepared for when we do see any increase in numbers going forward. Next slide. Thanks, Graham. So this is just something that Laura Williams, our operational manager, wanted us to communicate because she's not able to make it today. This just shows you when people come to us, as I was mentioning earlier, our focus of our homelessness strategy is early intervention. So that case there just shows you, that table, sorry, who comes to us with a threat of homelessness. So that's going back to that prevention that I mentioned earlier. And that's 21%. Who is actually homeless? That's 18%. But it's the advice and the intervention at the early stage where we are proven to be successful. So that's over 60%. And that's through the work of some of our, we call them welfare reform officers, but they're there to intervene early where someone's fallen into financial difficulty, and we try and help before a tenancy would be lost. So we use welfare rights, we use CAB, we look to try and help our employability team, but that is the main focus of our work. And I think that just proves the strategy that we're trying to achieve. Next slide, Graham. This just shows you on the homeless applications, the success. So the previous slide showed you who's coming to us. This shows you the actual what number of cases are prevented or relieved. So 58% were prevented and 39% were relieved. Next slide, Graham, please. And I think what Laura in particular was keen to show today was how we're performing compared to the rest of the country, because we're really proud of that. So of all of those households that we assisted, and 917 secured accommodation and 541 were helped to stay at home. We're actually 6th in the country. So I think we're really proud of that, and that table shows that, that we're up there with some of the top other councils. So we are doing really well in terms of the prevention and the people that we are helping to prevent homelessness. Thanks, Graham. Same as the relief. So again, those people who are actually homeless, this just shows you how we're performing. We're 17th, not as high as the prevention, but we're still proud of that. We're still up there. We're still, you know, there's a lot of councils in the mix, so we're still doing quite well in terms of how many people we're helping to relieve homelessness. Thanks, Graham. And that final one, when I mentioned that when we have a duty, so those people where prevention or relief hasn't been successful, we helped 105 people in 1920, and that has been an increase from the previous year. So I think going back to our homelessness strategy, this is where we've got to try and find more accommodation. Those people who are homeless and we've got a duty, sometimes we still struggle to find accommodation, and we've got to increase and have more accommodation available so that we can prevent or relieve at that earlier point. And that's what our strategy is all about. Thanks, Graham. I think one of the points we wanted to get across today, I guess, is looking at 1920, just see how we're performing in 2021 with COVID and what has happened. Has that changed our figures? Has that had any impact? So we've looked at between April and September, we've had just over 3,500 people come to us, and they're the reasons there that we've put down so you can see why people. The main reason is end of private rented tenancy, and that's been consistent throughout the last few years. Then it's family no longer willing to accommodate, and it's relationship breakdown. Once again, the majority are single people. That remains to be the household type who come to us. And of those, 582 were threatened with homelessness within 56 days and 840 were actually homeless. Next slide, Graham. So one of the things I think had been asked was, have we seen an increase with COVID, with the potential lifting of the eviction ban? So when we've looked at the figures in sort of from April to October, the same period last year, we've actually seen a decrease of 7%. So we're not seeing huge numbers of people coming to us or an increase, and it's something we're monitoring on a weekly basis. We get weekly statistics of how many people come to us. But that table there just shows you the main 3 reasons why people come to us compared with the up to April to October this year compared with last year. Same 3 reasons, but it's just moved around a little bit. So the main reason this year is that end of private rented tenancy. And then in 2019, it was family no longer willing to accommodate. So that just shows you what's happened so far this year compared to last year. Thanks, Graham. In terms of responding to COVID and some of the good work that's been going on, as I've mentioned, we haven't seen a massive increase. We have seen people coming to us in financial difficulty in the private rented sector, and we have done some measures to get round that with helping people, and Marion's going to go on to talk about that a little bit more when she comes on the call. We've also worked with our staff to do new ways of working and prioritising casework, because there's not that face-to-face now. It has proved quite challenging, but we have just come up with new ways of working so we can still help clients as much as we possibly can. Obviously, there are concerns about the eviction ban and the government's programme of everyone in, where there's no one to be on the streets. We've done lots of joint working with housing providers. We've developed an approach around the private rented sector, which is our ready to rent scheme. Again, Marion's going to talk to you about that shortly, and that's where we can match people up. We've had a rapid property matching for some of the cohorts, the prison releases, and we've helped with food and parcel emergency accommodation provision. So caseloads remain high. Obviously, we are trying to predict if they're going to increase and working around the eviction ban as best as we possibly can. Thanks, Graham. So that was kind of the strategy, some of the performance, some of the trends during COVID and how we've responded. And my understanding was that members of the committee requested something around working with registered providers and how that works and how we do that. So just a couple of slides on this. Internally and externally, we've got various partnerships to help deliver our objectives in both the housing and homelessness strategies. So internally, we've got a housing board that meets regularly. And that's just showing you there where members across the council are from. So there's myself, Graham, managers in Housing Solutions, colleagues in Regeneration and Development. So it's capturing the whole housing agenda and we work together. Thanks, Graham. This is just the structure of how we work with registered providers. So we have a housing forum, which is chaired by our Director of Regeneration Economic Growth, Amy Harhoff, and that's where all of the registered providers, chief execs meet to talk about the strategy. They have responsibility for the delivery of the strategies. Sitting beneath that, we have a development group who focus very much on the growth, the development, the new build. And then we have various individual meetings with housing providers, myself, Lynn, colleagues, dependent on the agenda. And then we have task and finish groups where they're very much the delivery doing groups around poverty, Durham key options, safeguarding, and we're now looking at specialist accommodation. So that's just the governance structure and included in the terms of reference that we have where we're working with partners. Thanks, Graham. And that's presentation from me, Chair. I know there was quite a lot of information in there, so it would be Marion next. I'm not sure if you want us to have an opportunity for questions or however you want to do that.
Thank you, Marie, and thank you, Graham, for that presentation for the first part. What I'd like to do, we've got a few councillors that are registered to speak. So I'll do is I'll invite Councillor Boys and Councillor Wilkes to make their comments, and then officers can respond. We'll do them in twos, because we've got 6 registered to speak. So if I can get David Boyce first, and then we'll have Mark Wilkes, and then we'll get the officers to comment on those, and then we'll move on. So David, over to you.
Right, thanks very much, Chair. Thanks for that presentation, Marie. I'm David Boyce. I chair Safer Stronger Communities at the council, and I represent the Easington ward on the council. I suppose my point is, you mentioned about a lot of people who's been rough sleepers, a lot of homeless, a lot of ex-prisoners, and I think you also mentioned there's a lot of areas where there's an abundance of empty properties that you've brought them back into use. Now, I suppose what's happening is you're marrying the two. You're bringing a lot of people who have been rough sleepers, but you've already said have got complex health needs, complex mental health needs, and a lot of them are former addicts. And I suppose in those communities, if you've got them marrying up, you've got a lot of people with these complex needs going into the one particular area that could cause problems in the community. So if you could just give me a bit of information about drilling down to where a lot of these people are going? Are they being spread out across the county, or are there any areas that, or communities that seem to have a lot of like ex-rough sleepers, ex-homeless, ex-prisoners coming into their particular communities? Thank you,
Thanks,
Chair.
David. Thanks very much, David. Councillor Mark Wilkes, please.
Good morning, Chair. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, Mark, we hear you fine.
So yeah, I was having some IT issues earlier. I notice, I just thank all the officers for excellent reports they're doing so far today, and for the work that they've been doing. 2 years ago, we agreed to double the number of staff managing empty homes from 3 to 6. In December last year, we deleted the management post in the department, and by May, June of this year, we'd relayed off the 3 extra staff we employed. The extra staff were employed off the back of a motion I put to full council, which was fully supported by every single councillor in the room. The figure we were shown earlier on of 212 homes brought back into use shows the excellent work that that department was doing with their extra staff. They hit the target set, so they were paying for themselves. And what does the council do? It deletes the management post and lays off half the staff. None of us, as councillors, were given any update, never mind a report on the work they were doing. I believe Scrutiny should be asking Cabinet to reinstate these posts. The numbers of homes brought back into use are already starting to fall. We've got 6,000 empty properties in the county, and instead of investing in this area, we've instead cut staff in half. It's not fair on the department, and it's not fair on the remaining staff, and I believe that we should be asking for those posts to be reinstated because those officers were doing an excellent job. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mark. Marie, Graham, comments on both of those, please.
Yeah, if I can, Chair, I would like to give the first question to Marion Rucker, who's on the call, because she's the operational manager for the rough sleeping team, and perhaps Alan Hunter to answer Councillor Wilkes' question, because Alan manages the empty homes, if that's okay.
That's fine, thank you.
Thank you. In response to Councillor Boyes, I manage the rough sleeper team, and I'm going on to a presentation about our work shortly. But in relation to your question, we do tend to house people right across the county, so we don't tend to put people all in one area. We tend to house right across the county, try and put people in areas that they're going to settle in, feel safe. And we also wrap a lot of support around those people. So we have tenancy sustainment officers, housing management officers. We've got a specialist substance misuse worker who works with people from meeting them on the streets into accommodation. And we host a number of multi-agency meetings for our complex clients. They happen either weekly or fortnightly, where we'll have all partners around the table and have a plan that is reactive to how that person is working. And in some cases, if we feel that somebody isn't settling in an area or they can't maintain a tenancy, we do look for a planned move to either supported accommodation or a different area.
Thank you. We've got Alan for the next part of the responses.
Morning all. My name is Alan Hunter. I'm a housing manager within the Housing Solutions Service. And with regard to your question, Mark, I'm actually going to cover the empty homes team shortly in the presentation. So I'm happy to answer it now, or if you'd prefer, I could maybe pick it up at the end of the presentation. Would that be better?
I think as long as it's covered, Alan, and Mark can get a response, then, you know, as long as it's not getting missed, that will be fine by me. Mark, if you're happy with that, we can proceed to the next comment, but it will be picked up, and obviously if it doesn't, you can have the chance to ask that question again.
Yeah, that's fine, Mark. I'll come back in if I need to. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Mark. In that case, can I invite, I'll take 2 again, but first, Councillor Richard Bell, please.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, my question's kind of like a cousin to Councillor Croot's question, because I've certainly got a case in Middleton, someone with mental health issues, drug issues, possibly facing the eviction by the social housing provider unless it can be sorted. So my question is really, you give the numbers of the immediate cause of homelessness, which is to say 899, I think, from private rental evictions, 850 odd because relatives will no longer let people stay. Now, but that doesn't say why that is happening. So have you got any information as to why? Because generally speaking, unless the landlord is actually wanting to sort of like sell the property and move on or something, if they have a good tenant, they would want to keep the tenant. So do you have any information as to why people are being evicted and not let to stay by their relatives, as opposed to like just the top line figure? Because if you're evicted from one form of accommodation, so you then get into social housing, but your issues continue and your antisocial behaviour still continues, you then face the prospect of eviction of again, and it's kind of like a revolving door. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Bell. Councillor Jim Atkinson, please.
Yes, Chair. My question comes from the selective licensing that was mentioned earlier on in the presentation. Is it all right for me to ask it now? If I ask it now, then you can park it if you need to answer it later on.
It's fine to see, Jim. It can always be covered later, as long as it's getting covered in the presentation.
Well, I'll ask the question anyway, and then, like I say, it's around selective licensing and a number of questions I've asked from landlords and things, and it comes from the guys who see themselves as particularly good landlords that are there already, that have assessed themselves to have been with certain houses have been put into an area where the system itself looks at that particular area as under par, if you like, and a little bit unfairly assessed relative to particular people who are good landlords already. So that was a question that was cropping up. But what kept cropping up when these people were mentioning it? They were always mentioning about, you know, the tax or the payments they have to have for the selective licenses. Eventually, will end up in the rent. And it seems to be a bit of a dichotomy, and I'm just wondering how we work out the fairness here, like, if not a paradox, that if eventually the licensing money will move down the line. It's supposed to be affordable housing, which will make it go up, right, for the tenant, of course. Now, we need to sort this housing out where these people won't keep the property, right? But we have to keep an eye on the fairness of it all and keeping the properties affordable. So, as I say, there's a question to be answered there, especially relative of being asked by people who are really good landlords who keep the kit and everything in line. The prices of the houses aren't going down because everybody around about them is happy with that, right? So if we can flip that question to somebody now or at the appropriate time, I'd appreciate that. Thanks very much.
Who would be the best officer to respond to both of those, please?
If I can suggest, Chair, I'll take Councillor Bell's. I'm able to answer that, and then if I can ask John Kelly, who's coming on selective licensing shortly, just to pick up on Councillor Atkinson's query, if that's okay.
Absolutely fine. I'm happy for you both just to dive in.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, Councillor Bell, we have provided very high level information there, but in answer to your question, yes, we do look at the more detailed information. So when someone comes to us, that's the initial reason they come to us. But as part of the Homelessness Reduction Act, housing officers then have to work up a personalised housing plan with the client. So that looks into a little bit more detail in terms of why they became homeless, what were the factors, what were the triggers. And the piece of work that we're doing at the moment is, as I mentioned earlier, we've got a better understanding of support needs. We're collating all of that now to understand why people were evicted or got into that situation and what can we do around that prevention agenda. So we've got a lot of data, a lot of detail, and by the end of January we'll have all of that pulled together, and we're then going to work with partners, public health colleagues, to try and help around support needs. So we do have that data because we think that's really important to have that.
Okay, thanks, that's helpful.
Thank you.
Just regarding the selective licensing question, I'll answer it at the end of my slides, if that's okay, Chair. The last slide is on the fee and finance, so I'll either answer it as part of the slide or first question as soon as the presentation's finished.
That'll be fine. Thank you very much. And Jim, obviously you're welcome to ask any further questions or come back on that at the time. The next two, the final two speakers in this section, then we'll go on to Marion to make some progress. Is Eddie Bell and Councillor Tanya Tucker. So we'll start with Eddie, please.
Chair, it's actually Councillor Eddie Adam, not Eddie Bell. I represent Aycliffe West.
It's my mistake. Sorry, Eddie.
That's okay, no problem, Chair. Two questions. The first one is in relation to Graham said earlier on in the presentation that he identified an annual report that would be produced that would bring all this data together, which I'm hoping that Marie's just referred to, will be in that particular annual report. But when will that report be available? And whether that report will actually be coming to overview and scrutiny, so we can look at the actual detail and we can make comment on. That's the first question, Chair. Second question is in relation to homelessness. And obviously we were given some basic information there in terms of the number of cases that have come through, and it was clearly identified that single people were a major issue in terms of people becoming homeless. My question is in relation to the housing strategy to deal with that. Do we actually have sufficient accommodation in the county to house single people? Because if you look at on page 21 of paragraph 12 of the main report, it says that we're actually going to focus on older people as part of the housing strategy. Shouldn't we actually be also looking at focusing on single people and single accommodation? Because it seems to me as if there is a possibility that there is a shortage there. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. Councillor Tucker, please.
Thank you, Chair. Morning, everyone. Councillor Tucker, Tanya Tucker, Woodhouse Close Division, Bishop Auckland. My question is around empty properties and homelessness and families that for no reason or no fault of their own find themselves in a situation where they can no longer live in the property that they're currently in. I'm just wondering how we marry up the fact that families in that situation who have children in school, there may not be a suitable property in the area that the family needs to be, and how we manage to accommodate that, put them somewhere that's really suitable for the size of their family, meets their family needs, but also allows the children still to attend the school that they're in, conscious of the fact that children don't always adapt well to moving schools, moving from their friends, etc., and how we take that into account. And secondly, Chair, if I may, it might well get answered in the selective licence and fee section, but I noticed in the report that the fee is £500 per property. I'm just wondering if my memory's faulty, because I could have sworn that was £300 originally, and could I just have some clarity on that, please? Thank you.
I think that'll definitely be covered on you can cover that one on the selective licensing area, Tanya, but in relation to the two queries, officers, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I can come in first on Councillor Adams' query. Councillor Adams' query was asking when the housing strategy and homelessness strategy annual reports will be published. The intention is that they will be published early next year. As you can imagine, it's been quite a year for housing, so we really are trying to capture sort of the council's COVID responses, etc., as part of those reports. The second part of Councillor Adams' query on that is that would those reports be available to be discussed at scrutiny? The response to that is absolutely yes. I mean, typically we do a housing update at least annually for scrutiny, and we would imagine that going forward, those reports and the findings of those reports would be part of that update to members. So you certainly would have an opportunity to consider the findings of those reports. And just to say as well on a query Councillor Adam raised around the priority for older people in the housing strategy, and then how that related to the homelessness need for single persons homelessness. I mean, just from a kind of strategic perspective, the housing strategy does identify a priority for older persons housing based on the demographic profile and demographic shift in the county and our understanding of those needs. So that's why that's a key priority area. We would suggest, however, that that housing strategy looks to meet the needs of all the residents of County Durham, and delivering older persons homes in itself wouldn't mean that you wouldn't be able to deliver accommodation for those single person homelessness, as Marie's sort of presentation set that out. So they are kind of the complementary elements, if you like.
Thank you.
I can come in as well, Chair, just to answer some of those questions. So just to pick up on Councillor Adams' query on the single persons, we have definitely recognised that we do need to increase the number of accommodation for single people, particularly those who have become homeless. So what we've done is we've established what we call a housing market position statement, where we are going to prioritise certain client groups, and single homeless is in there. We are proactively having conversations with different providers, whether it's in the social sector, the voluntary sector, going back to that understanding of need that I mentioned earlier. Is it that we need more supported accommodation with a number of bed spaces? Is it that we just need more properties where there's tenancy support going in? So we are certainly looking at that at the moment and have recognised that we need to increase that accommodation for single people. So yes, older persons is a priority, but also we addressing the single person issue too.
Thank you very much. I'm going to allow one more question in this section, and we're going to make some progress. It's Councillor Brian Avery, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, what I'm concerned about there, and I agree with David Boyes there about the number of empty properties in the county. I think I heard right. Was it 6,000? You said? Tremendous number. I represent Ferry Hill, and we have at the last count I counted, there was about 200 in Dean Bank at Ferry Hill. We've improved things recently by working with Benicia Homes, knocking about 50 houses down and landscaping and things like that. We are trying to improve the areas with wall cladding and things like that in another couple of streets. But a lot of these houses have stood empty for, well, as long as I can remember, 20 years, let's say. And there doesn't seem to be a programme to try to encourage private landlords to bring them up to a certain standard, because basically the old mining area and terraced houses, 2 bedrooms, would suit a single person if they were brought up to a habitable standard. I just wondered, what's the council's, let's say, aims and progresses towards this sort of thing? Because it is a serious problem all over the county, it looks like, especially over the eastern side, where you get all the streets all empty and things like that. We get problems with fly tipping and fires and things like that. It is a big problem. But I just wondered, what is the progress towards trying to bring some of these houses back up to livable standard? Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Avery. Is this going to be covered in the empty homes section? I'm mindful that we need to make some progress here. We've got a lot of, but as long as the issues are covered, I'm happy to park that for a second if the officer can confirm that's covered, or issues or it could be answered then.
It won't specifically be covered in its entirety, Chair. So I'm happy to give a quick answer to Councillor Avery if that's,
no problem.
That's okay. I think you're absolutely right, Councillor Avery. There are a lot of empty homes across in the main former mining communities. I think the big issue we struggle with and suffer from, unfortunately, is we've had, since a lot of the pit closures, we've had a lot of out-migration from the mining communities. So your population's declined, and unfortunately we have a lack of demand for many of the former colliery houses, terraced houses. With regard to the issue about the 2-bedroom properties, I think one of the issues there as well has been with regards to the bedroom tax, with people having to pay the additional rent, which obviously we've seen the consequences of that. exactly as you say, particularly in the east, but not solely in the east, across the county generally. So there are a number of sort of wider socio-economic issues, I think, that impact upon the rationale for empty homes.
Yes, well, you hit a good point there with bedroom tax. I'm constantly getting complaints about that. It really should be abolished if we could.
So thank you very much, Councillor Avery. Thank you for your answer, Alan. I've got one last, Councillor Tucker, can I bring you back in? You advised that the first part of your question hasn't been answered. We'll get an answer for that, and then we are going to move on to Marion Rucker because we do need to make some progress. But Councillor Tucker, can you advise which bit you haven't had a comment on?
Thank you, Chair. It was my question around helping families who have children in school find suitable property in an area that still allows the children to attend the school that they're happy with, or sort of something in relation to that, because children don't always adapt well if they're forced to move school, and their attainment could suffer. So I just wondered how we marry the two up, conscious that there's not always suitable properties, especially in my own area. So I just wondered if the team had some advice or some information regarding that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I can answer that one, Chair. Yes, Councillor Tucker, when our housing officers assess, and if it is a family, they do have to look at the suitability of the offer of accommodation, and children's schools, etc., is very much taken into account. I know there are occasions where they would struggle to find accommodation which suits that need. What I can do, because Laura Williams isn't able to be on the call today, she's the operational manager who heads up that service. I can get her to give you a more detailed reply in terms of what they do in that situation. I know it's taken into consideration, but other than that, obviously she may be able to give you more detailed answers, so we'll arrange that.
That's helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marie. I'm sure that will be very helpful to Councillor Tucker's query. We're going to move on now to the housing response to COVID, so I'll pass over to Marion Rucker for her section of the presentation.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Marion Rucker. I'm a housing manager within Housing Solutions. One of the first areas I'm going to speak to you about are our rough sleepers. And Durham received £550,000 from the Rough Sleeper Initiative last year to fund our rough sleeping work. That was part of a regional bid that Durham led on for the North East local authorities, where we brought in 1.7 million to the region. Out of our funding, what we received were funding for an outreach worker to work on the streets, carry out sweeps, look for rough sleepers, and then support them on their journey into suitable accommodation. A substance misuse worker who, again, works with rough sleepers on the streets to start looking at harm and substance reduction, making sure that they're using safe, making sure that everything is correct with their prescriptions. We have 2 tenancy sustainment officers who work with people once they go into a tenancy to ensure that the tenancy is set up, they're maintaining the tenancy, they're living safely, and deal with any issues that may arise. Our rough sleepers quite often have lived on the streets for a number of years, and one of the reasons for that is that they don't have the tenancy skills that we presume that people have. We also have a prison accommodation officer who works in HMP Durham and also on occasion with Lone Newton. One of the issues we had a few years ago was that when Durham changed to being a remand prison, we were finding a number of rough sleepers on the streets within the city centre. Those were people that had been immediate releases from Durham and just had nowhere to go to, didn't know how to get home, didn't have the skills to do that. So our prison accommodation officer works to ensure that anybody released from Durham is moved to their appropriate area or reconnected back to where they came from. And since she's been in post, we've seen a reduction to very, very low numbers, like 1 or 2 across this year, that are immediate release. And we also have our Somewhere Safe to Stay unit, that's 6 bed spaces, direct access for rough sleepers. So if we do find a rough sleeper, we have somewhere to accommodate them pretty much immediately. So that's what we received for 2020 to 2021. The bidding round for Rough Sleep Initiative Year 4 for the next financial year opens shortly, and we're just working with MHCLG to ensure that we're in a position to bid and have a successful bid again. Next slide, please, Graham. Thank you. So in relation to rough sleepers, as part of COVID, MHCLG announced the Everybody In strategy on the 27th of March and asked us as local authorities to house all rough sleepers that were on the streets. The reasoning behind that was that rough sleepers quite often are more vulnerable to COVID due to underlying health conditions and also illnesses that they could pick up on the street. It was a huge task for us. Obviously, the team cover the whole of the county, which you know is a vast geographical area. And from the 26th of March until the 20th of November, we've actually helped house 97 rough sleepers. Those numbers have increased on the previous year, and there are a number of factors behind that. Firstly, we have changed the way that we work with rough sleepers. We used to contract out for outreach support, where now we do that in-house and we cover the whole county. And due to COVID, a number of rough sleepers that would normally sofa surf or be accommodated via family and friends weren't, because people weren't allowed to have that additional non-household member within their family. And the other factor that we also saw were that people that had rough surf for quite a while but were quite hidden in woods or forest areas, living quite remotely, were then either reported in or reported in themselves as a result of COVID, asking for help and accommodation. So we had quite a lot happen around March, April, and the team had to work very long hours in order to pick everybody up and house them. We worked very hard with the private rented sector, our registered providers, and we've managed to house 50 of our rough sleepers in long-term accommodation. All of those people have tenancy sustainment support with them and any other support that they need. We have around 25 people currently in temporary accommodation where we're looking for that longer term offer, and I'll come on to those shortly. We have housed 15 of our rough sleepers in supported accommodation, and even though they're in supported accommodation with a supported provider, this team still stay in touch and stay with them in case they need us to pick them up again. And then we have 7 people who have either returned to the streets or started to sofa surf, and that's really been their choice. If we do find them on the streets, we do offer accommodation and support again, and we continue to do that. And the one thing that the team does is, when Marie spoke before about prevention, relief and main duties, quite often our rough sleepers have been through that process and are not owed duties or have had varying duties owed to them and discharged, where the rough sleeper team work with people outside of those duties where they're not owed. But we feel that if we didn't do that, they'd just continue to rough sleep. Could I have the next slide, please, Graham? Thank you. So future housing for rough sleepers, you may be aware from the publicity that the government have put out, they introduced NASAP, or the Next Steps Accommodation Funding bid, and we were successful to the tune of over £800,000 on that. So as part of that, we got the funding to cover the shortfall in housing benefits. So when we put somebody into temporary accommodation, so bed and breakfast, the council only received back a percentage of housing benefit, and there is a shortfall. So we've had that shortfall covered under the bid. We've had tenancy deposits for the increase in rough sleepers that we've been housing covered, and we have received funding to set up, in association with a support provider, a 9-bed complex housing unit that will support people with complex needs that we've picked up off the streets, and that will be specialist provision. We've also received funding to develop 5 one-bed flats specifically for rough sleepers, and they will be developed in the next year. That also comes with a complex worker to coordinate the support. And what we are doing is we're setting those flats up on the Housing First principles. So if you're not aware of Housing First, it's about housing people and trying to make sure that the tenancy is sustained, and then wrapping the support around people as they're needed. as it's needed. It's very successful in other parts of the county, and it's the first time Durham County Council will have done that work. So we're hoping to have that up and running May, June next year. And then the government have announced that NASAP is going to change to RASAP for next year. I'm sure they just changed things to confuse me. And what we're looking at is some of our existing properties that DCC own is bringing those into use for rough sleepers and bring them up to standard. Next slide, please, Graham. Thank you. One of the benefits we've had for the last 2 years is we have had a winter night shelter in Durham that's helped our sweat provision. So when the temperature falls to below 0 for a number of nights, the night shelter's always opened when it falls to below 1 degree. North East Mission run our night shelter. It's basically a group of churches, but they're set up as a charity in order to attract funding. And they are going to be opening again this year. The opening is imminent. We're just putting varying last minute touches to it. They work very closely with us. And this year we have had to work very differently because of COVID, where it was shared accommodation in a church hall or in church venues for the past few years. This year, Key Development have worked with the night shelter, and they've built individual sleeping pods in a youth centre to make it the facility COVID safe. Whereas in the past few years, people have just been able to turn up, self-refer into the project. This year, it's going to be local authority referral only, and it's limited to 6 beds, but that will help us greatly. It's also going to be much more planned than in the past, where they just put out that they were going to open that night. They're going to look at a long-term forecast each week and give us the nights that they will open that week. And it is only 6 beds this year, where before they've taken up to 20 people on occasion. This time it's only 6 beds, so we'll have to use them wisely. But as we've got the referral into them, we'll put that into all of our accommodation that comes available. Next slide, please. And then tenancy sustainment officers. So we have 2 tenancy sustainment officers. Their targets were for this year to work with 80 clients of low to medium support, where in reality they've worked with over 90 clients that have rough slept, and the majority of those clients are high complex needs. And that's something that we will address through our rough sleeper bid for year 4, whether it's additional staffing or more complex needs staffing. We will look at that and address that, and we've already had those conversations with the Ministry of Housing. The TSOs have been in place for around a year now, and they've managed to sustain their first tenancy for a year. That's a gentleman who had rough slept for 3 years prior to that, so that's an amazing result. We've actually had 12 clients who have sustained tenancies of over 6 months, so between 6 and 12 months. So the work that they're doing is really working and embedding people into tenancies. And as I said previously in response to Councillor Boyce's question, what we're also doing is we're looking at that housing. If we feel that it's not working, we're having that honest conversation with the client and trying to do a planned move instead of it being a failed tenancy, an eviction. We're trying to do a surrender of tenancy and a planned move either into supported accommodation or a different area where necessary. Chair, would you like me to answer the questions on rough sleeping before we move on to private sector housing?
Yes, if you feel that yes, if it's appropriate now, yes, by all means.
Thank you.
Right. Sorry, I thought you meant for a second there was questions that you'd got from before. It's my mistake. I do apologise. Right, I've got 3 speakers. We'll take them in twos. We've got Councillor Elizabeth Scott first, please.
Hi, yes, Councillor Elizabeth Scott from Neville's Cross Division. My query is about the somewhere safe to stay accommodation. I'm just interested to know what kind of take-up there has been with that, because I know some rough sleepers are very reluctant to use that kind of provision. And if it is proving to be successful, is it a sustainable offer? Is it something that we can keep offering? That's it, thanks.
And next we have Councillor Tanya Tucker, please.
Thank you, Chair. My question's about the winter night shelter, Marion. You say that we're having to work very differently this year because of COVID, reducing the number of spaces and being authority referred. I just wonder if you could expand on how that referral process works, and also if there's an oversubscription, how do we accommodate the people that we can't support in the night shelter? Where do they go?
Thank you. In response to Councillor Scott, yes, our somewhere safe to stay provision, when I looked at the statistics, we've had 131 referrals into that so far this year. So that's from April the 1st, and we only have 6 bed spaces. So at present, it is massively oversubscribed. We are looking at how we provide that in the future as part of the Rough Sleep Initiative bid for year 4. I take on board your comments that some people don't want to go there, and that's what we're trying to address. As part of Durham County Council's procurement measures, we can't just award that again this year. It has to go out to procurement. So we're looking at how we can change that, whether it'd be better having something that's dispersed across supported providers in the county to keep people more locally than bring them into, it's currently at the Fells at Chessie Street. Instead of bringing people into the Fells, would it be better to have something that's more dispersed? Would it be better to have direct access flats? We're doing that piece of work at the moment, but it is really oversubscribed. In terms of the offer, is it sustainable? People, it's a real short-term measure, so they stay there for around a week while we source other housing for rough sleepers, and then try to get that move-on plan in place. So it really is a short-term measure, and that's what the government set it up as, to just get people off the streets, a short-term measure to then move people on. But that is something that we're looking at when we're reviewing all of our services in line for our next bid. And Councillor Tucker, the referral process, because we'll have dates that the night shelter will open, we can then filter who would be better going into supported accommodation, who would be better going into some other form of temporary accommodation like bed and breakfast, and who would be more suitable for the night shelter. It has to be local authority referral. We have to carry out a risk assessment due to COVID based on people's health measures. So we've been working with Public Health Department to set that questionnaire up. So we need to do that. We hold that information. If somebody did turn up at 2 o'clock in the morning, needing a space, that the police had taken them along, which does happen when the night shelter's open, the procedure that we've put in place is that the night shelter then contact our out-of-hours staff, who will still go through that procedure if there is space. It's about keeping everyone safe, knowing who's in there, having the correct information for track and trace should it be needed.
Thank you, Marion, for those answers. Councillor Eddie Adam, please.
Thanks, Chair, for getting my name right this time. Thank you. In terms of future housing, the slide identified obviously a very successful bid for NSAP funding, which is obviously excellent news. You've identified a range of areas that this money has been spent on, and obviously it identifies some works going on up to 2024. My question is in relation to that amount of money. Obviously is very welcome, but how long will that actually sustain the shortfall in housing benefit, sustain tenancy deposits? Because I'm assuming here that the money is also related to the 9-bed complex and the additional housing. Thanks, Chair.
Yes, we received certain amounts for each of the awards. So the shortfall in housing benefit was quite complicated. We had to predict how many people we would have in temporary accommodation between now and the 31st of March and what that shortfall would be, which was quite a task actually to gather that information. And it was, so we have, that's provided until the 31st of March. If we have to house people longer than that, the government have said that they'll come out with another pot or another solution for us. Temporary accommodation isn't the best solution. So we are trying to move people as quickly as we can. For tenancy deposits, again, they have to be spent by the 31st of March. So we said that we do 20 deposits at the 3 months rent in advance to hold a property. Quite often, our client group are more problematic to house. We have to offer a higher deposit to landlords. So we're doing 20 deposits at 3 months in advance.
Thank you for that answer, Marion. We've got Councillor David Boyes.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Just with regards to rehousing former prisoners that's been on remand, I would imagine a lot of those people are not actually from County Durham if they're in Durham prison, and we've heard it anecdotally at my committee that a lot of the rough sleepers are not from County Durham. They're coming down from Tyneside and other areas because things are seen as a little bit better down in Durham. Just going forward, well, I can imagine this service is going to be in big demand, especially with the effects of COVID they come through. How do we ensure that it's going to be County Durham people that we're sort of accommodating, as opposed to people coming from other areas? And that, I'm sorry that sounds parochial, but I think as Durham County Councillors we need to be thinking about how we're dealing with our own people before we deal with other people. The more I'm saying this, I'm sounding really like as though it's a little Englander approach, but I do think we do need to look after the County Durham people before we look after other people from different areas.
Yes, in terms of former prisoners, what we do is we reconnect them back to their local area. So when they're released from prison, they should be given a duty to refer. So we ensure that goes back to their home authority. People have to have lived in an area for 6 months before we owe them any housing duties. So we try to connect people back to their local area. We do have people that turn up in Durham that are rough sleeping from other areas. Likewise, I've got people that are rough sleeping, I'll be honest, in Newcastle and Sunderland. We work to bring them back to the local authority area. We have a North East Regional Rough Sleeper Steering Group that I chair on behalf of the region, and we have protocols within that to reconnect back to local authority areas. So if someone is a rough sleeper from Durham, we're trying to bring them back to Durham. If they're from Sunderland, we'll reconnect them back to Sunderland and we'll have those conversations. And if anyone has been housed in our area, we receive what's known as a Section 208 notification to say that they've been housed in temporary accommodation or permanent. If it's temporary accommodation, we then pick that up and ask the local authority to house them back in their area. So we are working alongside that constantly.
Thanks for that, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Boyes, and thanks, Marion. I believe, Marion, the next section is yours again, private rented sector 2020 to 2021.
Thank you. So for the private rented sector, we've had a focus this year on trying to improve those standards within the private rented stock. So in order to do that, what we've done is we've realigned our patches for our private sector initiative officers. We've aligned them with empty homes officers so that we can do targeted work in each area. And work alongside CATs and maps and whatever's needed to target individual streets, villages. We've had a huge focus on knowing the tenure within each local authority area. My officers are out on the patch when COVID allows, when we're not in a tier 3 or lockdown, getting to know the landlords, knowing the properties, and being a physical presence out on the street. I strongly believe that by being that presence out there, people are more likely to approach you, know who you are. What we've also done is we've refreshed on training. So we've done HHSRS training, which is a regulatory standard for inspecting properties, so that all officers are inspecting on the same standard. It's the same standard that environmental health use, where we need enforcement doing on a property, environmental health carry that out. So it's making sure, so we've sat and made sure that all of our processes and standards link between the two to make sure that those prosecutions then happen. So we've done a lot of work this year on trying to improve those standards, making sure that the patches are all aligned so that we can work more closely, and making sure that we can enforce where necessary. Next slide, please, Graham. Thank you. One of the initiatives that we set up under COVID was a scheme known as Ready to Let. And we had issues securing accommodation during the first lockdown. Estate agents, everyone was told to close by the government. There was a caveat on that unless it was to relieve homelessness. We had obviously a number of rough sleepers coming in, people that needed moving from refuges, temporary accommodation, supported accommodation, and more people coming to us for housing. So we were facing a situation very quickly where we were going to be completely blocked with nowhere to put anybody. So we set up Ready to Let, where we phoned round lettings agents and private landlords and asked them to work with us within government guidelines and to ensure that they would notify us of any properties that they had vacant that were ready for let. We then pre-inspected those properties. So our normal procedure would be to, when a property's found, to then go out and inspect that property and then move somebody in. So we changed that around to make sure that the properties we knew were there, were ready, and put those on the list. We had issues as well, in addition, with contractors not working. So where there were minor defects on the property, such as, a door handle missing on the living room where it wasn't vital, we said that we could let that property, but that needed to be done. Those repairs needed to be done as soon as possible when lockdown ended. So we created a Ready to Let list, and then we worked with Laura Williams' team and supported providers to best match people to those properties to keep people moving. So people that were owed in main homeless duty, people that were in refuges, people that were ready to move from supported accommodation, where we had a new wave of rough sleepers waiting to go into accommodation, we matched properties to those people. And we worked with County Durham Furniture Supplies to make sure that properties were furnished and got people housed during lockdown. Ready to Let proved really successful in that we have a direct list of properties that we know are inspected to the standard that they should be, are in areas, meet local housing allowance, so meet the benefit criteria. And when we do get people in under main duty or relief duty, we have a set of properties there that we can then immediately offer, hopefully reducing those times that people are in relief or in temporary accommodation. Next slide, please. Another initiative that we launched in the private rented sector this year was a scheme known as Stop Before You Serve. So as you're aware, the government launched an evictions embargo during COVID. And the whole idea of Stop Before You Serve is it's an early intervention scheme to try and mediate and assist landlords. So landlords refer their tenants to us and the issues that they're having, and then we try to mediate. We had 45 referrals from August to November, and they were mainly rent arrears due to COVID. The situation that we really came across were that landlords didn't really know what was happening with the tenants, but the tenants hadn't communicated to the landlords. So we just put that communication in place, set up rent repayments, looked at people's benefits, advised people and worked with them through varying other teams to actually help them with their journals, direct payments to landlords. So we really asked landlords to hold their notice for 28 days while we do that mediation. So far it's been extremely successful, and we not only receive referrals from landlords now, we receive them from Citizens Advice, other departments, and also from the Homeless Service. When someone comes to us too early to be picked up as a prevention case, we're referring those cases over to Stop Before You Serve. So that's something else that we're going to continue going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Marion. For the purposes of this morning, I shall cover the Empty Homes team, the Housing Regeneration team, and the Home Improvement Agency, 3 specific areas of work that all fall under my remit. I shall start with the Empty Homes team. For anybody who isn't familiar with the team, they exist primarily, as the name suggests, to bring empty properties back into use. They would investigate and respond to complaints from members of the public, from local members, from just about anybody really. If anybody has an issue, we would certainly look into that. They then work with other agencies to identify the ownership of the property, and will advise, negotiate, work with and support owners in order to bring the empty property back into use. One of the tools that we have available to do that is we can provide financial assistance in the form of move-in grants and interest-free loans. The move-in grants are for grants of up to £2,500. I mean, specific low demand areas where there's been issues with long-term empty properties. The property would need to be empty for 12 months or longer and be in a band A or B. In terms of the loans, they can be up to £15,000, interest-free. There's a £250 arrangement fee, and they are also for empties that have been empty for 6 months or longer. The loans are repayable for up to a 5-year period. One other tool that we have, which is usually a tool of last resort, is the use of enforcement powers such as enforced sales, empty dwelling management orders, and compulsory purchase orders. Next slide, please, Graham. In terms of key achievements and performance, the Empty Homes team have always, since 2016 anyway, achieved their annual target. To date, as at the end of Q2, that's the end of September this year, they had brought 831 properties back into use since the 1st of April 2016. Last year, 1920, they had a target of 200. They surpassed that target and actually brought back into use 212 properties. And this year so far, in the first 2 quarters, they've actually brought back into use 99 properties, which, given the target's 200, and that was the halfway point, I think it's fair to say that they're on target. And I also think that given that we've been in the middle of a pandemic, and obviously that's impacted on the service and the council as a whole, I think that's particularly good performance, all things considered. In terms of financial assistance provided, there have been 5 empty homes loans and 4 move-in grants. Again, that's as at the end of Q2, so the end of September. So I think performance-wise, it's been going very well, all things considered, and we are on target to meet our targets for this year so far. We did have a next slide, please, Graham. We did have an enforced sale. We were successful with that at a property at Witton Park. We've also worked with the council tax team and council tax debt recovery to bring monies back into the local authority, and undertaken several successful interventions with a number of problematic empty homes across the county. Next slide, please, Graham. In terms of 5-year performance, I've just put that graph up there really just to show and indicate what has been achieved in the last 5 years, including this year. And as you can see, every year the target that's been set's been achieved, been surpassed quite significantly some years, and the target was increased last year up to 200 in line with the additional staff that Councillor Wilkes referred to. And again, that target was achieved, surpassed with 212. And again, just to reiterate, so far this year, we've at the halfway point brought 99 back into use. The target's 200. So I think all things considered with pandemics, that we are on target. I think that's very good performance. In terms of recent activity and recent changes, next slide, please, Graham. We have, and I'll refer back to Councillor Wilkes' question at this point. We did indeed take on 3 members of staff on temporary contracts with additional funding that came forward. 2 of those members of staff, their contracts came to an end on the 31st of March this year, so they were allowed to leave the employment of the council. One of the officers we still have in post, we've managed to fund that post, and that officer is still in post working within the Empty Homes team. But I think, as you can see from the performance so far, we haven't noticed too much of an impact in terms of the number of empties brought back into use. But we have brought in a number of changes fairly recently to try to mitigate against the loss of the 2 members of staff. We have looked at the patches, the areas the officers cover. We've tried to tighten those up a bit and ensure that officers are working in a tighter area, and also are spending less time basically travelling across the county and spending more time on the patch and bringing empty homes back into use. So far that seems to be working. Back in January, from the 1st of January this year, the existing manager for the empty homes and private landlord offices was allowed to leave the authority, and that in itself brought about some changes in that the private landlord offices and the empty homes offices' jobs were split. They were all together and performed one job role. That's now been split. Marion, who you've just heard from, manages the private landlord offices, and I myself manage the empty homes offices. And I think we've adapted well under the circumstances. And as I say, certainly performance doesn't seem to have dipped so far. In addition to performance, and refer back to Councillor Wilkes' earlier question, we do, in addition to purely bringing empty homes back into use, we actually also have a number of schemes that are in operation which also bring empty homes back into use, but they are not, those figures aren't counted in the performance figures which I've just gone over. We have the local lettings agency, what Marion's referred to earlier, but we also have a buy to lease programme whereby we're purchasing properties, empty properties, and bringing them back into use to assist with housing vulnerable individuals. So far we've brought 3 back into use, and we have 4 lined up, which we anticipate will come back into use in January. So that will be 7 from the buy to lease scheme, and then Marion herself has brought a number back into use through the local lettings agency. Next slide, please, Graham. In terms of bringing empty homes back into use, I've just included a number of slides here which really just give you an idea as to what can be achieved with a bit of imagination, some financial assistance and the wherewithal, and that's a property at 9 Rose Terraces, Waterhouses. Next slide, please, Graham. We also have a property there at 14 Station Road West in Trimden Station. Next, please, Graham. And Mill Houses, Stanley, that's an image, a photograph before the works were commenced, and the next slide will show you the works once they've been completed. So that gives you some indication as to what can be achieved, apart from obviously the fact that you're bringing empty homes back into use that have been long-term empty. Next slide, please, Graham. I'll now cover the housing regeneration team, which is responsible for delivering a number of neighbourhood, environmental and housing improvement schemes across the county as a whole. They predominantly work with registered providers in housing regeneration areas, landlords, government departments such as Homes England, housing developers and other interested parties, and look to facilitate regeneration within communities. A key part of the role is steering group work. Up until recently, we were heavily involved in a couple of steering groups, one of these in Corrie and one at Wheatley Hill, which were very successful. They've been going for a number of years. As I say, they're currently on hold due to the pandemic, but we hope to get those back up and running once we sorted with COVID. The team also develops bids and always looks to acquire external funding to deliver innovative solutions and bring money in to assist with any of the housing problems we have across the county. The team's also heavily involved in field poverty and energy efficiency, and undertakes a lot of work around external wall insulation, boiler replacements, field poverty issues, and also coordinates the Managing Money Better service, which is very successful, and I'll touch upon that when I come to the performance slide, in terms of working with individuals for fuel switches, people who have been overcharged, or people who just want to query any anomalies on their bills. Next slide, please, William. In terms of key achievements and performance, as Councillor Avery mentioned earlier, We've been heavily involved in work in Dean Bank in terms of previous demolition schemes, and in partnership with Benicia and Livin, looked at demolition and housing allocations, as well as environmental improvements in the area to uplift the area. We recently, probably within a couple of years ago, we enabled some bungalow development in Chiltern on the former Dean Terrace site, where we worked with Esh and Livin and built and developed 16 two-bedroom bungalows for rent. We are still looking at a phase 2 there on the former, the Hunter Terrace site and the garages site, and there's also been a medical centre built within Chiltern. In Hordern, there's been a lot of work going on in Hordern with regard to master plan development. We've undertaken 2 rounds of community consultation. One was before the master plan was developed to gauge the residents' views on what they thought were the issues and problems in the area, in the numbered streets area. And then we produced a master plan, which we then consulted on and asked the residents what their favoured option was within that master plan. The majority view was for some form of demolition. We fairly recently purchased the former Easington College Junior and Infant School in Easington. Anybody who's familiar with the school knows it's a bit of an eyesore. It's been empty for 23 years now, I believe. So we've been working on that and have brought that back into use. We've also delivered a number of group repair schemes across the county. The most recent ones have been in Dordon and Easington Colliery, where we carried out a number of improvements to private properties in those localities, which uplifted the area and the properties themselves. The Managing One Better service, which has won numerous awards and is constantly receiving positive feedback from residents in terms of enabling them to get bills down and save money and stop overcharging and look at the tariffs and fuel switching. We recently put a successful bid into Homes England and received £600,000 for the purchase and repair and lease to buy schemes. And we're currently working on a number of targeted delivery plans. They have been developed. I understand they are going to Cabinet in February for approval, where we'll be looking at a number of areas across the county to carry out some intensive regeneration works. Next slide, please, Graham. In terms of continuation of key achievements and performance, Lynn Grange, our Managing Money Better member of staff, has recently received a Heat Hero Award. We received North East Council of the Year for having the 4th highest uptake nationally of ECO grants and the highest number of fuel poor households assisted within the North East region. The Managing Money Better scheme, which I've just spoken of, has actually helped 264 households as at the end of Q2, so over a 6-month period, and saved almost £25,000 in terms of additional costs for those households. In 1920, 651 households were assisted, resulting in £116,000 being saved from household bills, again through fuel switching, overcharging, incorrect billing, etc. So that's been brilliant performance. And in terms of energy efficiency generally, we've managed to assist 251 properties benefiting from external wall insulation, boiler upgrades or boiler improvements. And we have the 6th highest uptake of fuel poverty grants nationally, and that was at the end of Q2 of this year. Next slide, please, Graham. And that's just to give you an idea of some of the areas. That's the Wembley estate in Easington before we carried out the group repair scheme a few years ago. Next slide, please, Graham. And that's the same estate once the works have been completed. As you can see, completely transformed, makes a really big difference to the locality, to the people who live there. So that's made a major improvement. Next, please, William. And that's a number of streets in Dordon, whereby we carried out some group repair works in that locality as well. That's obviously after the works have been completed. Next, please, Graham. And this is South Moor Stanley, just to give you an idea of some of the master planning activity that took place with the Sustainable Urban Drainage Scheme and some of the external wall insulation and works that were carried out to a number of properties in that locality. Next, please, Graham. And that's our Managing Money Better Officer, Lynn Grange, receiving the NEA's National Heat Hero Award from Kevin Shaw. That was an award awarded for recognition of all the hard work and all the achievements in terms of the Managing Money Better and fuel poverty work. Next slide, please, Graham. And finally, I just wanted to touch upon the Home Improvement Agency. This organisation is part of the Housing Solutions, provides advice and guidance to assist vulnerable people to live in their house, provides disabled facility grants, covers a number of areas of work which we can do and which assist individuals to remain in their property. It can be level access showers, ramps, stair lifts, through floor lifts, extensions, general property improvements if they assist the individual and that individual is then able to continue to live in the property. Next, please, Graham. Again, in terms of achievements and performance, so far this year, as at the end of Q2, there were 289 disabled facilities grants awarded and 3 home improvement loans. And the previous year's figures are there, which show that every year we've done a significant number of disabled facility grants and loans into properties. And all of those go to help towards individuals to remain in the property rather than having to move into some form of care. And finally, I've just included a couple of slides which will show, next, Graham, please, which show basically some of the works that we've undertaken. They'll show the before, and then we have an after picture. Next, please, Graham, which shows some of the work that once it's been completed, the difference it can make and how it can transform somebody's house and enable them to remain in the property. Next slide, please, Graham. And finally, this is just to give you an idea of some of the ongoing projects that we're currently working on. The buy to lease project, which I talked of earlier, which will bring empty properties back into use. The master plan at Horden, which is looking at the options around the numbered streets. The school at Easing, which has been purchased and the planning application has gone through for demolition. So we'll be looking to schedule in the actual demolition of that building. Targeted delivery plans, which I believe are at Cabinet in February, which will look at a number of areas across the county for specific interventions, which some of the worst performing areas in terms of empty homes, fuel poverty, etc., which we will target. The Chiltern regeneration continues and will continue with Hunter Terrace and the garages in terms of a second phase of bungalow work. Dean Bank's ongoing. We continue to work with Benicia and Livin in Dean Bank and look at environmental improvements in there. We continue to work with the steering groups and will do in Wheatley Hill and Easington. The empty homes work's ongoing all year, whereby we look at bringing empty homes back into use. The HIA provide the ongoing assistance and advice in terms of disabled facilities grants. And we have a number of work streams around energy efficiency, fuel poverty, warm homes campaigns, etc., which will assist individuals in terms of the energy efficiency, savings on fuel bills, and hopefully bring a number of people out of fuel poverty across the county. Thank you. That's my slide finished.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Marion, for both for the presentations there. Just before we move into questions, I'm advised by the Chief Scrutiny Officer, Stephen, that it would be appropriate for members, if you own private rented property, to declare that as the appropriate interest. I'll leave it with members to make those declarations as you see fit. Once again, we'll do 2 at a time, and officers feel free, once the 2 questions or comments have been asked, to just come straight back in rather than waiting for me, just to keep things smooth. First of all, please, Councillor Richard Bell.
Thanks, Chair. Richard Bell, Barnard Castle West. My apologies, I didn't introduce myself last time and I referred to Councillor Boyes as Councillor Croot, so apologies for that. And yes, declare an interest in the next item, selective licensing, which actually informs my present question, which is all really about fuel poverty and energy efficiency. Now, I've spoke to Amy Harhoff last week and she wasn't aware of this, and I only became aware of this last week on the back of a complaint from a constituent about the current Green Deal and the difficulty in accessing contractors, But essentially, the new issue is that the government is consulting, which finishes the end of this year, is consulting on banning letting property if your energy efficiency isn't C Charlie or above. Currently, you have to be E Eddie or above to let a private rented property. They're moving to C Charlie from 2025. Now, in the Dales, where we've got a lot of solid wall property, in fact, universally solid wall property, firstly, the feeling is that you already get marked down a grade if you're not on mains gas. And energy assessors have told me that you get marked down a grade if you're on oil or solid fuel heating, and that's the only option for a lot of people. And to get up, and the best grade you can get, if you do all the normal stuff, is effectively D. So if you do your normal, your double glazing and your loft insulation and low energy efficiency lighting, etc., the best you can get is a D. So to get a C, you'd have to do solid wall insulation and solar panels and the full Monty, really. And the point is really that's maybe doable if your house is worth a couple of £100,000, not a big deal. If your house is worth south of £100,000, that's a very big chunk. And even if the money's there, the question arises, are the contractors there? So I've sent this link to the scrutiny officers as well, and happy to forward it on. So I'm not expecting a response to that consultation, because as I say, I've only just found out about it. I guess my question for Alan is, do you have any sort of broad gut feel in terms of the houses that you've done up? And there's some great work that you've done there in terms of doing up some of these houses. Yeah, you know, the old terraced houses, the solid wall houses. Do you have any gut feel as to, in terms of energy efficiency, what, you know, a done up house is? And you talked about external wall cladding, again, a gut feel as to what the impact of that is. Because if we're looking at potentially having to sort of solid wall insulate tens of thousands of houses in 5 years, that could potentially have a very serious impact on the rental sector and a very serious impact on homelessness. Sorry to go on about that, Chair, but it's a complicated point.
Thank you, Councillor Bell. It's a good point. Can I invite Councillor David Boyes, and then Alan and Marion come back in straight away for your comments. David?
Yeah, thanks very much, Chair. And I just want to personally thank Alan and his team for all the work they've done in Eastern and Colliery. It's been a fantastic amount of work in very, very trying circumstances, as everybody knows. And that's particularly the point that I want to make, because you mentioned about empty properties and bringing them back into use, and people can get loans up to 15,000. But if it's such a low demand area, what we're finding is people are saying, well, I could be getting a £15,000 loan, I could be spending my own money, I could be doing the house up, bringing it up to habitable use. And what's the point? Because I'm not going to be able to let it anyway, and I'm just going to be sort of holding a big white elephant, if you like. And a lot of these streets, for other members, are like more than 100-year-old. They used to have toilets out in the yards and stuff like that, and they're not particularly desirable properties. And with the planned demolition programme of a few years ago, we knocked five of these streets down. Now, each one of those to compulsory purchase and then demolish cost £1.5 million, which that sort of money's just not there. It's not available anymore, especially since 2010. So we're having to manage these the best we can, but it needs a whole wraparound comprehensive solution. As you know, we need to be making these areas more desirable and more like just make them better for people who might want to come into the area. But just on that particular issue with the empty properties, how do we address that one where people might get their loan, they might spend their own money, but they're still going to be left with a house they can't do anything with? Thanks very much, Chair. Thanks very much, Alan, for all your work.
No problem. In terms of Councillor Bell's question, I do know, I can't give you the exact sort of SAP rating off the top of my head, but I do know that the external wall insulation does make a big difference. It's similar to people with a cavity, having the cavity filled with insulation. Obviously, with it being a solid wall, there isn't a cavity to fill, so therefore the cladding has to go on externally. In terms of obviously loft insulation, cavity wall insulation, and boiler upgrades, they all make a difference to the energy efficiency and the SAP rating of a property. I am aware that a lot of properties in the more rural areas are solid wall and very often suffer from being off gas as well, which, as you rightly say, does make a difference in terms of the costs for individuals in those properties. But I'm more than happy to come back to you, Councillor Bell. I can certainly make some inquiries in terms of likely uplift in terms of a SAP rating from EWI, if that's of any help to you.
Yeah, thanks, Chair.
Excuse me. In terms of with regard to Councillor Boy's question, firstly, thanks for the thanks, Councillor Boys. I think the difficulty with, as Councillor Boys rightly points out, and Councillor Avery mentioned this earlier as well, in a lot of the mining communities now we have an oversupply of older terrace stock. What we tend to find is that, generally speaking, people don't aspire to that type of stock anymore. People generally prefer to go for a newer house with a garage, a garden, an ensuite, etc. And obviously we've had out migration from the areas due to mine pit closures, so population declines and bedroom taxes all in there in the mix, added to the socio-economic issues. I think we would always try, and I think with the implementation of selective licensing, I think that will make a difference in terms of empty homes and the policing of empty homes. Certainly in my personal experience from managing a selective licensing area, I always found that when selective licensing was in place, it certainly improved the area. I can't say it was a panacea. I think it's not the answer to everything, but it certainly is a step in the right direction and a positive step in terms of accountability of landlords and the management of some of the tenants within those communities. I think when people are taking out loans, we would always work with them to try to facilitate a tenant for them. We do have the Durham Key Options scheme whereby we would encourage people to come on board, and we would obviously, if it's in a selective licensing area, then the tenants would be vetted. So I think there are certain things in place that we can do, but I think overall, generally speaking, we do have a lack of demand for the terrace properties, so it's very difficult to generate demand for all of the empty properties at the same time.
Thanks for those answers, Alan. The next two councillors to speak will be Councillor Mark Wilkes and Councillor Tanya Tucker. Starting with Councillor Wilkes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Declaring interest in respect to the next item, but to go back to the empty homes issue, just want to, and I do appreciate, we can see from the pictures that we've just been shown just how much of an impact having those staff can have, particularly in respect of empty homes and getting them back into use. But I come back to what was agreed in February 2018, which was this. Recent studies have shown that Durham County Council has the largest number of empty properties in the UK by council area. To address this, our regeneration department will identify 3 additional staff to work solely on bringing empty homes back into use, with a target of bringing 65 additional properties a year back into use over 3 years. Now, what we've seen is they've achieved the target, they've gone beyond the target, it's fantastic. But the posts have been deleted after 2 years. And one of the posts was actually 6 months with nobody in it at all. And during that time, we've also lost the manager of that department. So what we need to know is, why have we deleted these posts a year earlier than full council passed them? And in respect to the fact that we've hit the targets and exceeded them, of course we have, because the posts only ended at the end of April this year. So for those first 2 quarters, we had the extra staff there working hard and achieving this. And it makes no sense whatsoever to me. If somebody's doing a job that's self-funding itself, an excellent job that every councillor and the local authority voted on to approve, to then remove those posts without telling us when they're actually exceeding their targets just makes no sense whatsoever. So I'd like to know, why were those posts deleted early? And what are we going to do to get them reinstated? Because my understanding was that if full council passes a motion in respect of something, and we're then going to go back on it, we should at the very least as councillors be told why. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Wilkes. Councillor Tucker, please.
Thank you, Chair. My question is around fuel poverty and the money management support that's in place. Alan, you might not be able to answer my question, but I'm going to pose it. A lot of our families and young people, especially single parents, are forced into fuel poverty because they're forced by the suppliers to have prepayment meters, which as councillors and residents, we all know cost a lot more. I mean, I'll take an example of a young lady who came to me earlier in the week. She spends on average about £170 per month of her benefits on electricity and gas. She lives in a 2-bedroom property, has 2 young children. If you look at the average cost of a 2-bedroom property on a direct debit payment, it averages out about £82. So she's spending almost double just to keep the electricity on in her home warm because of the situation she's in. I'm wondering, given the fact that we're in extensive lockdown and people are in their homes more at the moment, and circumstances, what we're doing to work with providers to ensure that they aren't forcing people into these situations, and help if we can get them out of this prepayment cycle. What support would be in place to help people manage to ensure that they don't get into that situation again, given it's through no fault of their own? And the biggest group of people we've got are our youngsters who are leaving care, who get minimal amounts of money, and because of the nature of their tenancies, etc., providers will not accept them on a direct debit scheme, which will allow them to heat their homes, put their electricity on, and still eat.
Thanks for the questions. Chair, I'll refer to Councillor Wilkes' question initially. With regard to the 2 posts that have now, the 2 officers that have now left the organisation, Councillor Wilkes, my understanding was that their contracts were temporary up till the 31st of March of this year. That's why they were. That's why they have actually left the organisation. We've managed to keep 1 additional member of staff on, one of the officers. As I understand, revenue is being found from another source to, in part, source that. In terms of the performance, the officers left the 31st of March, but the first 2 quarters of this year, which is obviously from April through to the end of September, I think it is, that does show that we've brought back into use 99 properties, which is, you know, 1 away from the halfway point of the target of 200. So that does suggest that whilst we've tweaked areas and looked at various other issues within the team, that performance hasn't as yet, and I'm not saying it won't, hopefully it won't, but there's nothing to show that there's been a dip in performance at that stage. With regard to moving forward, we are looking at targeted delivery plans for specific areas. We do intend to carry out intensive interventions in some of the areas where they have the highest number of empty homes. And again, we're hoping that that'll reap rewards in that we'll be able to target a higher number and bring more back into use. Councillor Tucker, with regard to your question, I think you're absolutely spot on. I think there's a massive issue with prepayment meters. I think we're all aware of it in terms of the costs to the individual, the households. It's basically, you know, some of the most poorest members of society are being penalised, and it's certainly something I'm happy to go away and look at and come back to you on that. I'm not aware of any work specifically we do with the utility companies in terms of the prevention of use or any work around prepayment meters, but certainly we'd be more than happy to look at that. We do always work with individuals, some of which I'm pretty sure will be on prepayment meters.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Mark, do you want to come back in on that?
Yeah, I'd just like some clarification, if it's okay, Chair, please. These empty home staff posts started in June 2018. The motion was for a 3-year period. At the end of the 3-year period, if this was working, the officers' posts were going to continue. So the question is, why have those posts ended after 2 years instead of 3? And why end them if they're actually achieving the target?
In answer to your question, Councillor Wilkes, I commenced managing the team from the 1st of January this year. I can't really comment on my predecessor, Shirley Janes, but for whatever reasons at the time, the contracts that went out were temporary contracts which ran until the 31st of March of this year.
Thank you. Can I just, I'm going to come in. I think obviously the numbers don't add up there from what was agreed at the motion. And I think given that everybody voted for it, it's not only, I mean, it won't necessarily come from the committee, but just as a purpose of clarification, Councillor Wilkes has raised a reasonable point, and can we, through Stephen and Diane, make an inquiry to whoever to get a response back? I can't guarantee, obviously, the response will be to Councillor Wilkes' liking, but I think we do need to get an answer, please. So if we make those arrangements, that would be helpful. It's just what we would do with any query that comes from members that we can't immediately answer. So I think that's reasonable insofar as us getting a response, if that's okay, Councillor Wilkes.
Yeah, thank you, Chair.
Okay, we have, I've got a request to speak from Jim Atkinson and Alison Beatty. And I'll bring in Jim Atkinson first, please.
Yes, Chair, there's been a lot going on in this section here, but you know, I think I was listening out for my name getting a mention from the question that I asked earlier on relative to selective licensing, and I'm not sure it's being answered. I'm going to have to ask the question.
Over it again, Jim, just so the officer can comment.
Okay, yeah, my question was around about landlords and landlords that are good landlords, and the selective licensing is a system that picks out the poorer landlords, and there's a punitive system there. So it was about some of the ones I'd been speaking to had issues around how they'd been assessed. They were good. They have good properties, well looked after in places that have been assessed as poor areas and things like that. So they're a bit miffed at that one. And then my next, adding on to that, was the fact that it was a tax that all of the landlords were talking about moving the tax down, and obviously the tenant would end up paying the fees that they were going to have to pay. And on top of that, I was wanting to know, how does it make the poorer landlord, if he's a poorer landlord, he doesn't care, couldn't care less anyway, he would just put the rent up and not necessarily improve the properties. So it was around about a punitive thing relative to those who are really poor, rather than just get a license revoked, an attempt to, and who's going to police it? How are we going to police and make sure that it's difficult at this moment in time, because we know these tenants have responsibilities to keep the properties the right, and the landlord has, but you just don't do it anyway. And it seems that the good landlords are the ones who it's like trawling a net to catch the sinners, and the sinners are being caught as well. So if you could answer that. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself either earlier on. My name's Councillor Jim Atkinson from Makeley Feast.
Chair.
Thanks, Jim. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry.
I was just going to answer that, Alan.
Yeah,
Councillor Atkinson, I'm just going to run through the last few slides of today's presentation, which covers selective licensing. So I had noted your earlier questions earlier on during the meeting, and I'll cover them in literally just a few minutes, if that's okay, after I run through the slides.
Yeah, okay, John, I wrote your name down and completely forgot I had as well.
No
I'm sorry
problem.
about that. I apologise that.
No problem.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, John, for that as well. Councillor Alison Beatty, please.
Councillor Alison Beattie, Pelton Division, but also Vice Chair of Overview and Scrutiny. It was just on the point that's been raised by Councillor Wilkes. I think it would be fair to say that we do need some further clarification on this one, and I was going to actually say, in the absence of our chair being here at the moment, I think it is something that we can take forward with Stephen and Diane outside this meeting to just get further clarification, because it is our understanding that it was an agreement for 3 years, not 2 years. So we will get further clarification on that one. So sorry to go back a little bit on the agenda there, but obviously when I did type in request to speak, there was other people before me. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Beattie, and obviously I'm sure it'll be reassuring to know that the chairs of the overall scrutiny process appreciate the point that's been made. Right, and John has sort of come in there. He's going to be doing the last part of the presentation that we're going to have today, so I'll hand over to John, please.
Hi everyone, it's John Kelly, Housing Team Leader within the Housing Solutions Service. So we consulted on selective licensing from February this year through till August, and we'd attended the overview and scrutiny back in March just before the pandemic and lockdown, and ran through what the consultation data was and how the proposals were being pulled together. So it was an update on the consultation response and the final proposals that went through Cabinet in September and are going to be submitted to central government for their approval for the introduction of a licensing scheme. So we had nearly 1,200 responses come through online and through paper questionnaires, which were available as well. We received over 300 emails and 50 letters. There was a general split between those that responded. 40% were completed by landlords, 41% by residents, 3% by letting agents, and 20% by private tenants. So general even split between landlords and residents. And then in the middle, you had a small proportion of letting agents and 20% were private tenants. It was a multiple choice question, which is why it doesn't add up to 100%. So a landlord could also say that they were a resident in County Durham, for example. 59% of everyone that responded to the online and paper questionnaire strongly agreed or agreed that Durham County Council should ensure that the private rented sector is properly managed. 29% strongly disagreed or disagreed with that. That number did drop when we asked about the specific selective licensing proposals. So when asking if people agreed with how we were proposing to ensure the private rented sector was properly managed, which was selective licensing and the areas and the fees and everything else that we'd put forward, 45% agreed with that, whereas 52% strongly disagreed or disagreed. Only 7% of landlords and letting agents agreed, but on the other side, 78% of residents strongly agreed or agreed. So again, quite a split there, not just in terms of who responded, but how they responded. 90% of landlords said the scheme would have a negative impact on them. 41% of tenants said it would have a positive impact, with 32% saying negative, mainly due to potential rent increases cited, risk of eviction, etc. 67% of residents said that the scheme would have a positive impact for them. Following consultation, one of the issues that people had when replying to the consultation was the size of the area of each area within County Durham that we were looking at, that we were basing our data on. We chose middle super output area at consultation. The main reason for this is other local authorities that had applied to central government had based their areas on electoral divisions. We have 63 electoral divisions in County Durham, and we have 66 middle super output areas. A lot of the data supplied by the Office of National Statistics is at MSOA or LSOA level rather than by electoral division. So we thought it was fair consultation to look at the 66 MSOAs, and at consultation stage, we were proposing that 43 of the 66 should be included. However, after consultation, we decided to look at LSOAs, drilling down in greater detail, so areas not so large, not so high populations within each area. And by moving down to LSOA, we reduced the overall coverage of the selective licensing proposals. So at consultation, we were proposing 74% of the private rented stock in Durham should be included. And by the time we went through Cabinet in September, it was at 42% of the private rented stock. We also had a lot of feedback about the fees, and I'll come to Councillor Atkinson's question on the fee side in a moment, particularly from landlords and tenants who may feel that the rent increase was going to occur because the fee may be passed on to them. So we added a discount for National Residential Landlords Association members. Originally at consultation, we were proposing that for Durham County Council accreditation only. So we brought in the NLRLA. We also added a discount for landlords who had more than one property. We had responses saying that they had large portfolio holders and the impact on them would be greater because they had more properties, and obviously there would be greater fees for them. So we brought in a discount for multiple properties for every second onwards property that a landlord had. We kept the early bird applications, which means that landlords applying within the first 6 months of the scheme, they would get a substantial discount as well, which I'll come on to a later slide. In terms of the final proposals for submission, as I've just mentioned, by reducing to LSOA, we looked at the data at that level and proposed that 104 from 324 areas in County Durham should be included. So that's 32% by area. In terms of the private rented stock, as I've just mentioned before, it's 42%. We have split the proposals up into 4 designations, so basically 4 submissions to central government, all going as one. And the 4 designations are based across 3 conditions. So one of the designations, we are saying that the areas have low demand. Another designation, we're saying the areas have antisocial behaviour, high levels of. And another designation, we say have high levels of deprivation. And the 4th designation, even though there's 3 conditions, we're actually saying that those areas meet all 3 conditions, and we believe they meet the criteria that central government set out to say that that area has low demand, high levels of ASB, high levels of deprivation. The final map is in front of you now, and there's generally a split of areas in the north. There's a belt that runs across the north of areas, LSOAs, that will be included. Around 20 areas there, 20 LSOAs, and it's the same to the what I would call the Midwest approach in the south. There's around 20 areas that will be included on the proposals there. And then as you move across the south, climbing up towards the east, there is a lot of properties in the east. That's the area that has the most LSOAs included in it. There's a key in the bottom right hand corner. So the dark grey is the designation of antisocial behaviour, and then you have the bright blue, and that's where we're saying that they meet all 3 conditions. And then the darker blue is low demand. And then there's a light blue, which might be difficult for you to see on the screen, is deprivation. Just before I run through this slide, Councillor Tucker had asked at the beginning, had she seen that there was a £300 fee earlier this year? It's never been as low as £300 stated anywhere. At the very beginning, at the turn of the year, there was a media release that said we were looking at a fee of around £390 to £590, which is maybe where the 300 is came from. By the time we went to consultation, we were saying that the fee would be £500 and that those accredited with DCC would pay £390. So it already came down from the £590 potentially maximum then to the £500. Now going forward, the starting level will be £500, but discounts will be applicable. So those applying within the first 6 months would pay £440. If they are accredited as well as applying within the first 6 months, it would be the £385 you see on the bottom row of the table there. If there are multiple, if they have multiple properties, as I mentioned on the previous slide, we are now giving discounts to landlords with more than one, and that's where the subsequent column comes in. So if you have more than one property and you're applying early in the first 6 months, you'd pay £405. If you are applying early and you're also accredited, the fee could be as low as £350. In terms of I'll answer the question during the slide if that's okay, Chair. In terms of one of the questions that Councillor Atkinson asked about fairness, it has been noted as a risk that landlords have said, not all, but many have said that they'll pass the fee on to the tenant. It's noted as a risk. The only way we could guarantee that didn't happen would be to not bring forward the selective licensing scheme. We hope that landlords don't do that. I've spoken to quite a few during the course of the year. As I say, some have said they will, some have said they won't. It it's part of the reason we have looked to try and make the fee is for want of a better word, competitive with other local authorities. £500 we feel is lower than many others. It's why we brought in a range of discounts covering those landlords that say that they're good landlords. They'll be accredited with DCC potentially, or accredited with the NLRLA potentially. They'll look to comply and apply early, and that's where the applying early bird discount comes in. And the landlords that have said they'll be greatly affected having multiple properties, we've tried to award a discount there as well. We are hoping that landlords will see the benefit over the 5 years of the scheme, and they'll see that potentially they may get some or all of that money back in other ways. Multi-agency work, and the fact that they may have neighbours, even though they're a good landlord, they may have a bad landlord in the same street with them that's causing a knock-on effect to either their tenants, their rents, potential voids, low demands where they're struggling to rent properties out in the first instance. But to answer the question as honestly as I can, there's no 100% guarantee that we can stop landlords passing that on. Obviously, we've reduced the scheme substantially from 74 to 42% to bring the numbers right down in County Durham. And we are also looking at instalments, which was said in consultation would be an issue for landlords. And we're trying to look at ways without increasing administration and increasing the costs to ourselves, how we can offer instalments to the landlords that are mostly affected by this. Next steps, and then I'll answer Councillor Atkinson's other question about fairness on areas. Next steps, submission to the Secretary of State is happening any day now, any day soon. It will go in before Christmas. Decisions expected in the guidance. It says that they'll give us a response within 8 weeks. It may actually take a few months. They've said the priorities obviously are elsewhere at the minute with a pandemic, so it may take a few months for them to come back with a decision. The scheme could change in size in theory. Once they come back with that decision, they could agree with some designations and not others. And then we would look to go live in the spring towards the summer. We have to give a 3-month notice period to landlords and tenants. We have to post notices in the area of County Durham that we're proposing licensing in. In terms of the fairness to landlords about how the areas are chosen, just first thing, the legislation doesn't allow us to selective licensing legislation doesn't allow us to pinpoint towards just any single landlord as we choose. It does have to go by an area. So an area could be a cluster of streets, it could be LSOAs that we've looked at, it could be MSOAs. As I say, with other authorities, they've tended to go by electoral divisions. A lot of landlords will declare themselves as good landlords, and you can see that in certain areas or by certain dealings that we have with them. But the assessments that we'll look at and the inspection programme that we'll put in place may or may not confirm that, and then it will throw up the bad landlords, as Councillor Atkinson mentioned. But the legislation, as I say, it doesn't allow for us to pinpoint landlords. However, as Alan said before, it's an important tool that kind of pulls a lot of other tools that we've got together already in County Durham across not just housing but other directorates, and we're not expecting it to solve all issues, but we do think it will be something important that can build on everything partly of what you've seen today within the housing remit that we've already got within Durham County Council. I think that's the last slide.
Brilliant, thank you, John. Would it be possible to stop sharing the screen now so we can get members back on the screen, please? And whilst you're doing that, our first two speakers will be Councillor Tanya Tucker and Mark Wilkes. We'll start with Tanya, please.
Thank you, Chair. John, thank you for answering my question from earlier. My question at this point is the areas that have been identified for the selective licensing scheme. How are we going to ensure that landlords in those areas actually take part in the scheme?
Thank you very much, Councillor Tucker. Councillor Mark Wilkes, please.
Thanks, Chair, and I'll reiterate my my declaration of interest. The first thing I'd like to say is that normally when Durham County Council does consultations, I end up complaining that we're basically just doing a tick box exercise. But I have to say on this occasion, it's welcome to see that many of the concerns that have been raised to many of us as councillors from local residents have been listened to. And it's a testament to the officers who've been dealing with this and to the portfolio holder that they've actually listened on this occasion to what has been asked and looked at it to make sure that it is something that will be workable. And one of those points is in relation to the possibility of some way of means of being able to make the payments. And what I'm wondering is whether or not having annual direct debit payments for the fee is the more sensible way to go. And the reason I say that is because at the end of the 5-year period, what happens then? Do we have to go back to every landlord in every one of these areas that we carry on running this scheme in, assuming that we do, and that the criteria still meet? Do we have to go back and ask for the money again? Or is it simply a case of if, for example, there's 26 areas and, I don't know, 5 of them change, we simply turn off those direct debits? So it just strikes me that it might be more sensible. And the other thing is just purely from there's a cash flow situation for landlords, but there's also from a point of view of not everybody's going to be holding properties for the full 5-year period. So where's the fairness in terms of that from a point of view of somebody paying something up front and then the year after perhaps they get rid of the property, as an example, or you've got the possibility that that down the line somebody's circumstances change. So I just wonder whether or not, or even a property is no longer rented and it gets bought by somebody and lived in by the owner-occupier. So I just think that having that in as a direct debit situation would be a far more sensible option. And I'm just wondering if the officer could just confirm that you're definitely considering that.
I'll answer Councillor Wilkes first, if that's okay with it being the last one. Yeah, I can definitely confirm that instalments are being looked at. Management are really keen, and we said during the consultation with landlords in the webinars and by emails, telephone calls, etc. It was something we were listening to, particularly because of the time that we're going through at the moment with COVID and the other stresses, not just on tenants but on landlords as well. So I can confirm whether or not it was annual, or it may work out that we may need quarterly over a shorter amount of time potentially. And as I say, I'm just giving examples over the first couple of years, quarterly, or maybe it's annual over the course of the 5 years, etc. But yes, I can confirm the instalments are being looked at, and there will be some form there to try and support the landlords as much as we can. Councillor Tucker's question. So how will landlords take part? With it being legislation, with it being law, it will be mandatory for them to obtain a license. It's dissimilar to accreditation in the sense that it's not voluntary. We're not asking them to take part. It's something that they'll have to follow. This is subject, of course, to central government approving the scheme, because it won't become law unless they agree with Cabinet's decision and approve it. We'll have a large team that will work on monitoring, on compliance, making sure that landlords are. There are many ways that we can check that landlords are complying and that they're coming to us. We've obviously gathered quite a lot of data already for the purposes of consultation that we'll build on to find out where the landlords are, where the properties are. We'll speak to tenants. We will do everything we can. We'll robustly monitor over the course of the 5 years, hopefully as soon as possible in the first year or two, and find as many of the landlords that aren't complying as possible. And then obviously there are routes there that we can look to take them to court for non-compliance and impose civil penalties, etc.
Thanks, John. Councillor Wilkes, you indicated, do you want to come back on a point you've heard, or is this a fresh query?
Yeah, I'll do it now, Chair, really quick. When you look at the fee for some parts of the county, it's potentially 2 months' rent. If you look at even some of the terrace properties in places like Dean Valley, you could end up with 2 months' full rent on these fees. Now, my understanding was that the purpose of these fees was to pay entirely for the employment of the staff who are going to manage the scheme. I have a slight issue with that, in the sense that I actually think some of this money should be going into assisting to regenerate some of these areas that are really run down. But I accept that this is the way we've set it up, and maybe we've got to look elsewhere for regeneration money. But to take 2 months' rent out of somebody's pocket of a property that may not even be, that they may not even be able to rent regularly because of some of these areas, the type of areas that they are, and the number of empty properties in some of these areas, it's potentially going to mean that we have properties getting into such a point of disrepair that they become classed as uninhabitable, and then they wouldn't even be part of the scheme at all. So I just think we just need to be very careful about the way that we do this in terms of how these charges and fees are made. But also, I'd be interested to hear from any of the officers as to where do you propose to get the additional funding that we need in order to do the additional things in some of these areas that really is needed.
John, before you come back in on Councillor Wilkes's point, can I meant to do it at the start. Councillor Atkinson, you raised a couple of times during the meeting the questions. Did you get everything you need in terms of an answer, or is there anything else you need clarified just while we're dotting the I's and crossing the T's?
Yes, Chair. Thanks very much. I just wanted to make a comment after John had finished saying what he had to say to try and clear up exactly what I was getting at with the question. In order for the licence to work, the policing has to be punitive, heavily against poor landlords, so the licence provides what it seeks to achieve. Would it be an idea, alongside revoking the licence for poor landlords, that is some kind of system that highlights a success rating that actually provides incentives and benefits to the good landlord, as opposed to just providing them with a licence? I just wanted to make that comment, Chair. Thank you.
No, I appreciate it, Jim. It's obviously want to be sure you've had everything covered. So, John, comments on those 2 points, please.
I've noted down Councillor Atkinson's last comment. We're always, even though we're outside the consultation period, we're always looking to take on any suggestions, comments councillors have got. They can email or call in direct. And yes, it's something that we'll look at. We've done something similar in the past with accreditation in terms of a star system. And we'll be looking to try and support and provide the good landlords who are complying early and working with us as much as we possibly can do during the working protocols with all of the internal and external agencies. So I'm not sure it was a question specifically, but it was a comment that Councillor Atkinson feels is a suggestion, and as I say, it's noted, and I'll speak to managers about it.
Yes, thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Thank you to those. Do you want to comment any more on the comments made by Councillor Wilkes, John?
Again, it's noted that yes, the finance to a landlord, which is why a large majority of them were against the scheme, and they've given some positive comments to certain elements of it, but it's the fact that they're seen as paying for it. So I've noted those comments as well. I think it builds in with the instalments and how it'll work and the fairness of it. We said during consultation we would look at individual circumstances. Some landlords may feel that paying the money up front in certain circumstances works for them, and then other landlords may need a little bit more assistance. We've said we could do even financial assessments with landlords. Some may not want that. They may say, I don't want to go through that with you, and we could look to do some sort of criteria where we will try and assist as much as possible, because we're not burying our heads in the sand. We understand that it's them paying the fee that's then funding the scheme and funding the staff that can be used for it. I think his second comment, if Alan doesn't mind me passing that one to him, was around regeneration. Selective licensing fee can't be used for on the ground improvements like that by law and the guidance that's there. So I think Councillor Wilkes was asking where additional money may come from to assist with things like that. So Alan, can I pass that back to you?
Yeah, sure, John. It's a very interesting question, Councillor Wilkes. I think that we constantly work with government agencies such as Homes England. We've recently been in discussions with them around funding for another scheme throughout the county. Unfortunately, at the moment, central government and obviously government agencies such as Homes England don't have specific regeneration funding available for such activities as acquisition and demolition. What we've had previously with the previous Labour government is that they had a funding stream called Housing Market Renewal, which local authorities were able to bid for resources to tackle such issues as oversupply, empty homes, excess stock numbers, whereby that resource was used to acquire and demolish stock, which ultimately brought supply and demand back into alignment. At the moment, the current government, the current regime, is more interested in numbers. in terms of net gains, in terms of properties, rather than acquisition, demolition, and regeneration in a number of areas. We constantly look at what funding is available. We're always reviewing and always looking to submit bids for any resources which we feel would help us to achieve and to carry out some further regeneration throughout the county. But I think a lot of the what I would maybe refer to as bigger regeneration schemes that we've done in the past, funding for such schemes on that scale is unfortunately no longer available.
Thank you for those answers, and thanks to the following councillors for their patience. Councillor Richard Bell and David Boys will take your comments next and then get some answers, starting with Councillor Bell, please.
Thanks, Chair. My comments are both related to what's been raised by Councillor Atkinson and Councillor Wilkes. So I heard what John said, that you can't, by the legislation, selectively licence bad landlords. But what I'd like to see is, once the money starts rolling in and you employ the officers, that you concentrate on the bad landlords. And I'm minded of you know, the early days of the Child Support Agency, when they went round looking at court orders, trying to squeeze money out of people who were already paying, rather than squeezing people who were paying nothing. So, you know, you have got discretion in how you deploy the officers that you hire, and that needs to be targeted at the problems that we're trying to solve. And then my second point really was a bit about the licensing. Are you licensing the landlord or the property, or both, and the transferability of it? So if it's like an EPC that lasts for 10 years, it goes with the property, but this would appear to last for 5 years. But does it go, if you've got licensed landlord A sells to licensed landlord B and the property has been inspected, is that a smooth transfer, or does it have to be inspected again? The whole kind of like, what are you licensing, the person or the property or both, and how does the transfer market kind of operate within that? Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor David Boyce, please.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Thanks for that report, John. As a member who's had a selective licensing scheme going in my area, in the Wembley area of Easington, I would say it was a great success eventually. It first got designated in February 2009. 5 years later, I think we were struggling to get 50% of the landlords still signed up. And the reason for that was because the CUTE, they were sending bits of information. I think there was about 15 bits of information they needed to send in. They were sending it in dribs and drabs. A lot of the times they were sending wrong information, and the officers had to send it back and get it back. And I think the girl who was dealing with it at the time, she had a nervous breakdown. She was like in a really bad way, the poor lass. So I think that's a pitfall we need to be aware of, and it will happen. They will do it because they don't want to pay the money, basically. The other problem we had was that the fines that were being given out by the court were a lot less than the fees that were having paid for the licensing. And I went down to Newton Aycliffe once, and there was one landlord, and he had 5 or 6 properties in the Wembley, and he got a £250 fine. Now, the fees for all the houses he was supposed to be paying was going to be about a couple of thousand. And he just winked as he came out. He said, well, I'll take that. I'll take a £250 fine over a £2,500 licence fee any time. So it was bringing the whole system into disrepute. The decent landlords, and Richard Bell mentioned this, you know, the decent landlords, they were abiding by the rules. They were passing their information in, and they were saying, well, what's the point? What is the point of us doing it when 5 years later, there's only 50% of us signed up? And I would say even towards the end of the scheme last year, we were still struggling to get 90-odd%. We didn't get 100%. So I think we need to be aware of this, and this is going to be on a lot bigger scale. This Wembley Street was just 6 different streets. This is going to be a county-wide scheme, which means the problems are going to be massive for all the officers involved. So I just think we need to be aware of these problems that will happen. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Boyce. Really helpful anecdotal information there. And is there anything you want to comment on that, John? There wasn't really any questions, but
take Councillor Bell's point, concentrating on the bad landlords again. From top down, management have said that it's the bad landlords that should be the ones that have a lot of the resource put on. So as soon as the scheme's put up, we'll look to guide the resource across. In terms of transferring licenses, so the license is for the liable person for that property. So technically the license is per property. You can't just have one license per landlord. The legislation says it's per property. Some of the reasons around that may be the fact that we may do an inspection on one property 1 year and then another property another year, and the first time the property came round, it may appear to be a good landlord who potentially maybe knew that we were coming out to inspect. We'd given them the notice, and then a year down the line we may find a portfolio of properties that are lesser. So it's definitely per property, but it is also for the liable person, which 9 times out of 10 is for the landlord and the letting agent. But 100%, yeah, we don't want to punish the good landlords once we find who the bad landlords are. Councillor Boy's comments noted as well. All I could say is that you learn from previous schemes, and also not just within County Durham but nationally. So yeah, take on board that they were quite small schemes, maybe with a small staff and resource there, and this is a much bigger scheme. So even though it'll have its negatives in the sense that people may say, oh well, it's a much bigger scheme, how are they going to manage that? We'll also have the resource to be proactive and get out there and inspect the majority of these properties and try and tackle some of the bad landlords. So I know it wasn't really a question. I suppose I'm saying we completely agree.
Can I just ask though, Chair, just quickly come back. Have we got the courts on board this time? Because they weren't on board back in 2009 through to even just a couple of years ago. If they're going to give paltry little fines, landlords are going to say, well, I'll take the fine. I'll take the fine every time, and then I don't have to pay this large fee. Have we got the courts on board? Because if we haven't, then it's going to bring the whole scheme into disrepute.
Yeah, we have, and we'll continue to work with them. I was surprised myself to find that the fines were so small, because usually they'd be larger, but sometimes that can be done on the assessment of the finance of that landlord. It's not necessarily just the fines and the legalities of prosecuting somebody. The landlord without a license can't rent that property out. They would have to put another liable person forward. We would keep going back, as Councillor Bell suggested, and we'd inspect it again. And if it still wasn't up to standard, to put another liable person forward. We can look to obtain the rent through rent orders from the landlord. So it's not necessarily just the prosecutions and the fines, it's the impact on the landlord and his business if he can't obtain that license to rent the property out. And we will keep going back, and we will ensure we've got the resource there and the courts on board to try and get the good outcomes that everybody's wanting.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, John.
Councillor Tucker.
Thank you, Chair. My question's quite speculative. We were talking earlier, I think it was Councillor Wilkes, who wondered if we could use some of the money raised from licensing to put into regeneration. As we know, this government is asking local authorities and developers across the country to build new homes, and the council itself is investing in working with developers and other organisations, other partners to build new homes, an element of which is social housing. I'm just wondering if there's any scope within those schemes to raise funds or to get funds to help with regeneration, mainly because the more new houses that are built, the less desirable some of these properties are going to be, and at some point nobody's going to want them. Thank you.
Alan, again, I'll answer the first part in terms of the working that we'll be doing with other services, but it may just be that you may need to reiterate your previous answer regarding the regeneration and finance. So the good thing about licensing being within the remit it is everything that you've seen today regarding the empty homes and the homelessness, the rough sleeping teams, it all kind of fits in. Some people may not see that at first, but it does. So when people ask about what finance the council are putting into schemes like this, well, we're actually putting finance into other services, other teams, not just within our service, but other directorates such as community action team that are out there. The fact that more neighbourhood wardens have just then been employed by the council. So there are other things going on all the time, but I understand that the public might not necessarily see that when we put a scheme out like this and they say, well, what else are you doing? all of these other things that have been advertised during the course of the year. So we will be working closely with the regeneration team. Any bids that Alan, as he said before, that they can see that there's money for funding may then link in and improve licensing. And same with the empty homes teams. We'll be working closely with their officers. Hopefully we'll all be working in a streamlined way around certain areas, working closely together, and they should see the benefit from that, both landlords, tenants, other residents. So it should all tie in together. But the specific question that you're asking us, I suppose, around finances is probably for Alan to say again what he said before. Alan, can I just pass you across?
Yeah, no problem, John. Yeah, Councillor Tucker, just to reiterate, I think at the moment, certainly from central government, regeneration funding has certainly declined as to what it used to be a few years ago. Well, more than a few years ago, to be honest. We're always on the lookout for any kind of regeneration. We do have internally, we do have the towns and villages funding pot, which has got a significant amount of resources in that we try to access and do access for some of the communities and some of the regeneration work that we look at. Unfortunately, that pot of money's spread thinly across the county. So by the time it gets to a specific community or a specific locality, it's generally watered down quite a bit. Like I say, we're always on the outlook for external funding in terms of pure acquisition, demolition, any funding streams I'm aware of at the moment. But we do work closely with Homes England, who have promised us that they are looking at nationally trying to influence the government in terms of the housing market, because central government policy towards housing does seem to be quite London and South centric, as opposed to the north, the northeast, the northwest, where we have, I think it's probably fair to say, a different set of problems and issues with some of our housing stock. So we're constantly on the lookout for any additional funding, but at the moment that external funding is very slim.
Chair, could I come back on that one, please? I understand the external funding limitations, Alan. I think I didn't word my question as clearly as I hoped. It was to do with investments that the council is working on. Whether, I think my question would be, if there's any potential profits coming back into the council, if there was discussions around a portion of that being put into our regeneration fund, given the limitations of external funding. We've got to get the money from somewhere, and it's going to dry up. So it was a speculative question, and you may not be able to answer, but were discussions or conversations being sort of taking place around this?
Well, as far as I'm aware, the discussions are always ongoing around how we can fund certain activities. It's probably a question better answered by some of my sort of finance colleagues, if I'm honest, but we are always in discussions to try to get resources for certain projects.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've got nobody else registered to speak, so can I take this opportunity to thank all of the officers for attending this morning. They've given excellent presentations with loads of detail. So I would like to thank you all for the incredible amount of work you've done, both in the service and in putting together our presentations this morning. It's really, really helpful. The recommendations of this section of our agenda for members is that we note and comment upon the information provided, which we've done, and that we include a further update on the development of Durham County Council's housing and homelessness strategies, delivery of regeneration and empty homes projects, work undertaken with registered providers, and the operation of the selective licensing scheme in the 2021-22 work programme. I think we can provisionally agree that, and it will be ratified in the future after the election by that committee at the time. But so moving on in terms of our agenda, we go to item 7, which is the minutes from the meeting of the County Durham Economic Partnership, provided for information. It was held on the 17th of July 2020, pages 83 to 90 in your packs. Diane.
Hi, thanks, Chair. As the Chair's mentioned, the minutes are from the County Durham Economic Partnership, which was held on the 17th of July and have basically been attached and for members' information. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Diane. Item number 8 is such Other business has, in the opinion of the chair, sufficient urgency to warrant consideration. I've not been notified of anything like that at all, so that brings to an end the business for today. Can I thank all members for your attendance and participation this morning, and I hope to see you all fit and well at our next meeting. If you can please remain seated until the broadcast ends, and with that, I adjourn the meeting.